You are about to embark on a long journey into the earliest years of Wu Zetian, born in 624 CE in the province of Shaanxi, in a family of modest aristocratic standing. Her father, Wu Shiwei, was a minor official in the Tang bureaucracy, and her mother, Lady Yang, came from a family that had served the court for generations. To modern eyes, these details might seem unremarkable, yet they foreshadow the complex interplay of family influence and personal ambition that would later define Wu Zetian's life. In the Tang Dynasty, social hierarchy was rigid but permeable, depending on your family education and opportunities. Wu Zetian's early environment, both home and village, revolved around Confucian ideals: obedience to elders, diligence in study, and preparation for service. From an early age, she was exposed to the nuances of official life, the rituals, the documentation, the meticulous record-keeping, and the subtle language of deference. Her family, though not extraordinarily wealthy, had enough standing to afford her education uncommon for girls of the era. Wu Zetian's schooling was extensive and included not only calligraphy, poetry, and literature, but also practical knowledge of governance, history, and ritual propriety. The Tang Dynasty placed great value on scholarly ability, even in women who might one day serve in the palace. It is worth imagining the young Wu Zetian poring over historical texts, memorizing the names of dynasties, and observing the precise arrangement of rituals in her household, preparing herself quietly for the world that awaited beyond her family home. In 637 CE, at the age of 13, Wu Zetian entered the palace of Emperor Taizong, the third emperor of the Tang Dynasty, as a concubine of relatively low rank. Her life at court began in one of the most constrained circumstances imaginable. Concubines were not only restricted physically, they were bound by rule about clothing, movement, and speech, but also socially, often competing with dozens or hundreds of other women for attention and influence. Wu Zetian, however, distinguished herself in subtle ways. The palace in Chang'an, the capital, was a city within a city, vast and meticulously ordered. It contained not just living quarters for the emperor and his family, but also administrative offices, storerooms, temples, gardens, and corridors for eunuchs, guards, and servants. Within this microcosm of imperial life, every day followed a structured rhythm of rituals, meals, audience sessions, and leisure. For Wu Zetian, observing and mastering this rhythm was crucial. She learned quickly which courtiers held influence, which eunuchs could carry messages, and which rituals could be leveraged for advantage. Much of her early skill lay in observation rather than direct action. Records from the period describe her as intelligent, attentive, and unassuming, qualities that allowed her to move through the palace without attracting dangerous attention while still gaining the notice of influential figures. She would memorize names, lineages, and habits. She would note the patterns of who rose and who fell from favor. In essence, she was laying the groundwork for understanding power itself, not through force or charisma, but through detailed, patient attention to the mechanics of court life. It is easy to overlook how significant this early education in palace dynamics was. Outside the palace, girls might learn needlework or household management, but Wu Zetian's education was a preparation in strategy. She became acquainted with the mechanics of influence, learning that subtle gestures, careful speech, and strategic alliances could shape her destiny more profoundly than any single bold act. Even the mundane aspects, serving tea in the correct order, walking with measured steps, and knowing when to remain silent, became tools in her arsenal. During these years, Wu Zetian also had to navigate the limitations imposed by being a woman in Tang China. While the dynasty permitted some social mobility, particularly for women connected to influential families, the palace could be unforgiving. Rivalries among concubines were frequent, often fueled by jealousy or ambition. Punishments were harsh, including demotion, expulsion, or even death in extreme cases. Wu Zetian's careful observation of these outcomes helped her internalize the subtle rules of survival: when to speak, when to remain quiet, and how to gain favor without provoking suspicion. Equally important in her early life was exposure to the intellectual and spiritual currents of her time. Buddhism was a significant influence in the Tang Dynasty, offering moral guidance, philosophical reflection, and political utility. Wu Zetian would later use Buddhism as a tool of governance, but even in her youth, she was introduced to Buddhist texts and rituals. She learned to read sutras and observe meditation practices. These activities were not merely spiritual exercises, they were training in patience, focus, and endurance, qualities essential for navigating court life. Even in her earliest years, Wu Zetian demonstrated a capacity to turn constraint into opportunity. While many concubines competed openly for attention, she cultivated the appearance of modesty and humility, which paradoxically drew attention from those in power. Her talents were thus recognized quietly, without provoking the kind of envy that could endanger her in a palace rife with intrigue. She was learning one of the most essential lessons of her later rule. Influence often grows silently, through preparation and strategic patience, rather than through overt confrontation. Her life in the palace was not without loneliness. Removed from her family and surrounded by rivals and eunuchs, she had little personal freedom. Yet this isolation also provided space for reflection and learning. She could read, study, and observe without distraction, gradually forming a keen understanding of human nature, political calculation, and the often invisible levers of power. It is in these small, seemingly mundane details, learning to read the expressions of courtiers, noting the flow of gossip, understanding the subtle differences in ritual, that Wu Zetian's early education in power truly took shape. As Wu Zetian grew older, the early seeds of ambition began to show, though still muted by caution. She recognized that her status as a low-ranking concubine limited her options. Yet she also understood that every court experience, every ritual, every interaction, every quiet observation could become a stepping stone to greater influence. The stage was set for a remarkable transformation, but at this moment she remained just one among many, a young girl in a vast palace, quietly watching, listening, and learning. By the end of these early years, Wu Zetian had accumulated more than just knowledge of palace life. She had developed a kind of inner discipline and strategic foresight. She had learned patience, discretion, and the art of calculated speech. These traits, honed in the unremarkable daily rhythms of court life, would later enable her to maneuver through the most complex and treacherous political landscapes of the Tang Dynasty. Yet at this point, her journey remained unresolved. She had not yet seized power, and the mechanisms of her eventual rise were still hidden in the minutiae of her observations and decisions. What is perhaps most remarkable about Wu Zetian's early life is how ordinary and constrained it appeared on the surface, and yet how it laid the foundation for extraordinary political achievement. Even the smallest details, learning to serve tea correctly, memorizing the names of officials, understanding ritual timings, became tools of survival and influence. The seemingly boring, repetitive life of a young palace girl was, in fact, the beginning of a carefully constructed education in power. And so, as we leave Wu Zetian in her early years, we are left with a question that would shape the rest of her life. How could a girl, born into modest circumstances and place, at the margins of court life, transform herself into the only woman to rule China as emperor? The answer, though still far away, begins in the quiet, measured steps of these formative years. By the late 63 years, Wu Zetian had spent several years navigating the labyrinthine corridor of the Tang Palace, honing her skills in observation, discretion, and subtle influence. The patterns she had quietly studied, the ways power moved, how favor could be won or lost, and how personal alliances mattered, would soon form the basis of her first real steps toward political significance. In 640 CE, Emperor Taizong's court was a place of considerable complexity. Taizong himself was an astute ruler, deeply invested in consolidating the power of the Tang Dynasty after the turbulence of its founding. Within this environment, the role of a concubine, even a low-ranking one, like Wu Zetian initially was, could become unexpectedly consequential. Concubines in the Tang court were arranged hierarchically. At the top were the empress and a few high-ranking consorts. Below them were numerous concubines of varying rank, each assigned specific quarters and duties. Socially, these women were isolated from the male officials who ran the state, but intimately involved in the emperor's domestic life. They were both observers and participants, witnesses to the intricate rituals of daily palace life, from formal audiences to private meals, from seasonal ceremonies to routine inspections of stores and gardens. Wu Zetian's intelligence and composure allowed her to navigate this structure carefully. Unlike other concubines who sought attention with flamboyance or intrigue, she learned the subtler forms of influence, timing, observation, and strategic participation. One of the first signs of Wu Zetian's rising prominence came from her intellectual accomplishments. She had mastered classical literature, historical precedent, and poetry, an unusual feat for a woman in her position. In a court where Emperor Taizong valued scholarly ability and literary talent, this quietly distinguished her from her peers. Stories from the era suggest that she composed poetry that pleased the emperor and demonstrated her grasp of both Confucian propriety and Buddhist philosophy. These small demonstrations of intellect were more than personal achievement. They were strategic signals that Wu Zetian could participate meaningfully in the intellectual life of the court, an environment where influence often depended on perception as much as reality. Yet, her ascent was not linear. In 649 CE, Emperor Taizong died. According to Tang custom, concubines without children were often sent to Buddhist convents or secluded to avoid interfering with succession politics. Wu Zetian, being childless at the time, was placed in Garnier Temple, a Buddhist convent outside the palace, as a nun. By conventional measures, this could have ended her political trajectory. Many women in similar circumstances faded from historical record, their potential influence extinguished by ritual exile. But Wu Zetian's time in the convent was not a period of decline, it was another stage of education. Removed from courtly distraction, she had the opportunity to study Buddhist scriptures in depth, meditate, and observe the politics of her former home from a distance. Here, she absorbed lessons about authority, morality, and public perception. Buddhism, already a major influence in Tang China, offered her a framework for understanding power in spiritual as well as temporal terms. She learned to craft moral narratives and to understand how religious authority could intersect with political legitimacy, an insight she would later use to justify unprecedented actions, including her eventual assumption of the imperial throne. While her contemporaries might have seen her exile as a setback, Wu Zetian perceived it as preparation. She watched the politics of the Tang court unfold from afar. She saw which officials gained influence, which factions vied for control, and how rumors and perception could alter destinies. She likely also maintained secret lines of communication with allies in the palace, carefully positioning herself for a return to relevance. These years of quiet study and strategic observation became essential to her understanding of power. Authority could be built not just through immediate access, but also through patient positioning, reputation management, and the cultivation of networks. In 655 CE, her opportunity arrived. Emperor Gaozong, son of Taizong, had ascended the throne and had maintained close observation of palace dynamics, including the talents of women who had previously served in his father's court. Wu Zetian was recalled to the palace, initially as a concubine of Gaozong. This return was not merely ceremonial, it placed her in a position where her talents could again be displayed. Gaozong, unlike many emperors, was receptive to counsel and discussion, particularly from women who could navigate palace subtleties. Wu Zetian's combination of intelligence, discretion, and cultivated virtue made her increasingly influential. Her influence grew steadily, in part because she mastered the delicate balance between visibility and subtlety. She was careful to avoid overt rivalry with the empress or other high-ranking consort, instead employing strategy to gain the emperor's trust and admiration. Historical records indicate that she was meticulous in her speech, measured in her gestures, and patient in her ambition. These qualities allowed her to exercise influence indirectly, guiding decisions and subtly shaping the emperor's perception. The Tang court, like any large bureaucracy, was sensitive to alliances and factions. Wu Zetian skillfully built connections with eunuchs, palace staff, and officials who could act as intermediaries, further amplifying her presence. She also began to cultivate relationships with literati and scholars, demonstrating her intellectual prowess in a way that reinforced her moral and cultural authority. Her rise was thus a combination of personal talent, strategic networking, and timing, an ascent that seemed almost inevitable once the initial conditions aligned. By 655 CE, she had achieved a remarkable milestone. She became Gaozong, Empress Consort, replacing Empress Wang, who was deposed and eventually executed. The process was both political and personal, reflecting the intricate interplay of palace intrigue, family influence, and imperial favor. Wu Zetian's transition from concubine to empress was unprecedented. In many ways, she leveraged her intellect, her strategic patience, and the alliances she had carefully nurtured, while also utilizing the moral and religious arguments that justified her elevation. The narrative is, on the surface, straightforward. A woman rises to prominence in a male-dominated court. Yet the details reveal the extraordinary precision, calculation, and foresight involved. Even as she assumed the role of empress, the challenges did not end. The Tang court was still populated with powerful officials, rival factions, and a bureaucracy accustomed to male leadership. Every decision, every movement, and every alliance mattered. Wu Zetian now had access to power, but wielding it effectively required continuous observation, patience, and the ability to anticipate responses. She had to navigate suspicion from officials who doubted her authority, manage the emperor's confidence, and maintain the loyalty of allies within a volatile environment. The early years of her influence as empress illustrate her mastery of subtle power. For example, she carefully managed the balance of authority with Emperor Gaozong, ensuring that her opinions were respected without provoking open conflict. She understood the importance of perception, appearing virtuous, intelligent, and restraint increased her authority more than overt displays of ambition. She also recognized the role of ritual, ceremony, and religious symbolism in consolidating power, frequently invoking Buddhist and Confucian ideals to support her position. By the end of this period, Wu Zetian had transformed from a quiet, observant concubine to a politically influential empress. Her rise was gradual, almost imperceptible, yet it reflected the careful accumulation of knowledge, alliances, and strategic positioning, each seemingly small action composing poetry, observing court rituals, forming alliances with eunuchs, and studying religious texts contributed to her ability to exercise influence effectively. Yet, even as she reached this pinnacle, questions remained. Empress status was significant, but it was still shared authority. The palace remained filled with rival factions, bureaucratic opposition, and the constant scrutiny of both the emperor and the public. The transformation of Wu Zetian from influential empress to the only woman emperor in Chinese history was not guaranteed. It depended on her ability to navigate an increasingly complex and dangerous political landscape, a challenge that would test the limits of her intelligence, patience, and strategic foresight. The critical question now becomes, how would Wu Zetian transform this position of influence into full sovereignty? How could a woman in a male-dominated imperial system consolidate power so completely that history would remember her as China's only female emperor? The answer lies in her next steps, the subtle manipulations, strategic alliances, and decisive actions that would allow her to shape the Tang Dynasty in ways few could have anticipated. By the late 65s, Wu Zetian had fully established herself as empress consort alongside Emperor Gaozong. Yet, the true test of her capabilities was only beginning. Being empress granted prestige and formal authority, but it did not automatically confer control over the Tang bureaucracy, powerful court factions, or the succession of the throne. The palace was still a complex ecosystem of officials, eunuchs, ministers, and rival consorts, each with their own ambitions and strategies. In many ways, Wu Zetian's early life, her meticulous observation, patient study, and cultivated intellect had prepared her not for survival alone, but for mastery of this environment. One of her earliest strategies was to place loyal allies in critical positions. She recognized that the Tang bureaucracy functioned as a network where influence depended on knowing who controlled which levers of power. By cultivating relationships with scholars, administrators, and eunuchs, she created a network of intermediaries who could extend her reach beyond the private quarters of the emperor. Each alliance was carefully considered. Loyalty, discretion, and competence were more valuable than status or wealth. The process was subtle, almost invisible, yet highly effective. Another key aspect of Wu Zetian's consolidation was her mastery of imperial perception. She understood that authority relied not just on the capacity to command, but also on the image of legitimacy and virtue. In this, she drew upon both Confucian and Buddhist ideals. She presented herself as a morally upright and intelligent guide to the emperor, advocating policy and decisions with the appearance of concern for the state rather than personal ambition. At the same time, she leveraged Buddhist rhetoric to support her growing authority. The invocation of divine and moral justification for her influence made her presence not only acceptable but desirable to a court accustomed to male rule. The Tang court was far from a static environment. Factions vied for influence. Officials schemed to advance or protect themselves, and the emperor himself could be swayed by personal relationships or favoritism. Wu Zetian learned to read these dynamics with precision. She observed which officials were ambitious, which were cautious, and which could be persuaded to align with her vision. Rather than engaging in overt confrontation, she used careful manipulation, timing, and calculated intervention. For example, she would subtly suggest policies that enhanced her position, ensure the emperor received reports favoring her allies, and quietly marginalize rivals through patronage networks. Yet perhaps the most audacious aspect of Wu Zetian's consolidation was her engagement in succession politics. Emperor Gaozong suffered from periodic illness, which created uncertainty about the future. Wu Zetian recognized that controlling succession, ensuring her sons or trusted allies occupied key positions would be central to her eventual claim to authority. This required delicate maneuvering, promoting loyal officials, subtly discrediting rivals, and maintaining the emperor's confidence in her guidance. These actions were executed quietly but with long-term strategic intent. Her tactics also extended to neutralizing threats. Historical accounts indicate that Wu Zetian did not shy away from eliminating potential obstacles, whether through demotion, exile, or, in some cases, execution. These actions were always framed as the protection of state stability, the moral order, or the emperor's welfare, maintaining the appearance of propriety while consolidating her power. The precision and patience with which she operated made her rise seem almost seamless, yet each step involved careful calculation and attention to risk. By the 66 years, Wu Zetian's influence over Emperor Gaozong was profound. She had effectively become a co-ruler, guiding decisions on appointments, policies, and state affairs. She was deeply involved in governance, particularly in areas where her insight and judgment surpassed those of traditional advisors. Contemporary records suggest that she often reviewed documents, drafted edicts, and advised on legal matters, showcasing both competence and an understanding of bureaucratic procedure that few women or men could match. Her presence fundamentally reshaped the inner workings of the Tang court. Even more remarkable was the gradual cultural and symbolic shift she achieved. Wu Zetian cultivated an image that was simultaneously maternal, virtuous, and commanding. She understood that authority was reinforced by perception. A ruler or co-ruler who appeared moral, competent, and divinely sanctioned was far harder to oppose. Through patronage of Buddhism, careful presentation of ritual propriety, and strategic public appearances, she transformed her image from a concubine to a figure whose authority was rooted in both personal ability and moral legitimacy. Despite her extraordinary consolidation of power, the ultimate goal, complete sovereignty, remained ahead. The court was filled with ambitious officials, members of the royal family, and traditionalists who viewed female authority as an anomaly. Wu Zetian's continued influence depended not only on her own skills, but also on her ability to anticipate challenges, manage perceptions, and act decisively when opportunity arose. She had demonstrated patience, intelligence, and strategic foresight, but the transition from co-ruler to sole ruler would test every skill she had developed. In this period, Wu Zetian also became increasingly aware of the fragility of power. Alliances could shift, the emperor's health was unpredictable, and court intrigues were relentless. Every favor, promotion, or demotion had long-term implications. Historical records suggest she maintained meticulous attention to the timing of actions, often delaying decisions until they could have maximum effect. Her patience was not passive, it was an active form of strategy, informed by deep understanding of human behavior and institutional mechanics. By the end of this phase, Wu Zetian had effectively laid the groundwork for the most remarkable transformation in Chinese imperial history, a woman ascending not just to influence, but to the throne itself. The seemingly mundane skills she had cultivated, observation, study, discretion, alliance building, and strategic timing, were now fully integrated into a coherent approach to power. The trajectory from concubine to empress consort had been completed, and the path to emperor was emerging. Yet even at this moment of consolidation, uncertainty lingered. Could a woman truly claim the mandate of heaven and rule a male-dominated empire without provoking rebellion or destabilizing the dynasty? How would Wu Zetian navigate the remaining obstacles, from court opposition to succession crisis, to achieve the unprecedented step of proclaiming herself emperor? These questions set the stage for her ultimate ascent, a story of calculated audacity and political mastery that would leave an indelible mark on Chinese history. As we leave Wu Zetian at the end of her rise from concubine to empress, it becomes clear that history is often shaped not by dramatic battles or public spectacles, but by the quiet accumulation of knowledge, the careful cultivation of relationships, and the strategic use of opportunity. Her story reminds us that the ordinary rhythms of life, reading, observing, forming alliance, can, when combined with insight and patience, lead to extraordinary outcome. Imagine entering Chang'an, the bustling capital of the Tang Dynasty in the mid-7th century. From the outside, the city is a thriving hub of trade, culture, and governance, with streets lined by merchants, artisans, and travelers from distant lands. Within this urban expanse lies the Forbidden Palace, the heart of imperial authority. To most, the palace is an abstract symbol of power, but for those living inside, it is a structured world governed by rules, hierarchies, and rituals so precise that even a minor deviation can carry consequences. For the young Wu Zetian and her contemporaries, life within these walls is both a physical confinement and a complex educational experience in discipline, obedience, and observation. The Tang imperial court is arranged hierarchically, reflecting the Confucian ideals that permeate the state. At the apex is the emperor, whose authority is absolute yet ritualized. Surrounding him are the empress, high-ranking consorts, officials, and eunuchs, each occupying precise roles. Every corner of the palace, from the emperor's private quarters to the gardens, from the audience halls to the kitchens, is organized according to strict protocols. The physical layout of the palace mirrors the social order. Proximity to the emperor signifies status, while distance reflects rank and influence. A misstep, even a minor one in posture, speech, or timing, can signify disrespect and result in demotion or exclusion. Education in this environment is multifaceted. Young women, especially those of noble birth or who serve in the palace, are trained not only in literature, poetry, and calligraphy, but also in ritual, etiquette, and the intricacies of palace politics. They learn to interpret subtle cues, a glance from an official, the placement of a ceremonial object, or the timing of a bow. Each action carries meaning, and understanding these meanings is essential for survival and advancement. For instance, knowing which side of the hall to enter, which hand to hold a cup in, and the proper sequence of steps during a ritual could distinguish between favor and disfavor. Wu Zetian's early education in palace life illustrates this principle vividly. Even before she became empress, she absorbed knowledge about court hierarchy, the subtle channels of communication, and the rhythms of power. The palace operates like a living organism, with every individual concubine, eunuch, official, or guard performing specific functions that sustain its existence. To outsiders, these details may appear mundane, arranging incense burners, following the schedule of meals, or observing ceremonial chants. Yet for insiders, they are crucial lessons in the interplay of structure, discipline, and influence. Daily life follows a rigid schedule dictated by ritual and necessity. The emperor rises early, and the court's activities revolve around him. Officials gather for audiences, decisions are recorded meticulously, and ceremonies punctuate the day. Meals are not casual affairs, they are formal, structured, and imbued with symbolic meaning. Each participant's position at the table reflects rank, and the order of serving signifies authority and favor. Even minor breaches of protocol, such as reaching for a dish too soon or speaking out of turn, carry significance far beyond the immediate act. For those in Wu Zetian's position, mastering these details is a prerequisite to influence. Rituals form the core of palace life. Seasonal ceremonies, religious observances, and ancestral offerings follow precise formulas derived from Confucian and Buddhist traditions. The palace maintains a full calendar of these events, and preparation for each can take days or weeks. Young women and concubines participate in these rituals not merely as observers but as active participants, learning the symbolism, the choreography, and the hierarchical interactions involved. For instance, the lighting of lamps during a Buddhist ceremony is not only a spiritual act, but also a display of order, attention, and decorum. Participation signals competence, awareness, and moral propriety, all qualities valued in those seeking influence. Restrictions are an equally important aspect of palace life. Movement is limited, courtyards and corridors are assigned, certain chambers are off limits, and access to the emperor is highly controlled. Speech is regulated, every word may carry weight, and gossip or misstatement can be dangerous. Clothing follows strict codes, reflecting status, season, and occasion. Even colors carry meaning, with certain shades reserved for the emperor, empress, or select officials. Personal freedom is minimal, yet within these constraints, individuals learn the subtle art of influence, negotiation, and adaptation. Wu Zetian, like her peers, becomes adept at operating within the limits, turning restriction into a kind of structured opportunity. Education is not limited to ritual and etiquette. Intellectual cultivation is equally prized. Literature, poetry, history, and philosophy are part of the curriculum for young palace women of status. Wu Zetian, for instance, would spend hours memorizing historical texts, composing poetry, and debating philosophical concepts. This intellectual exercise serves dual purposes. It signals competence and moral refinement, and it trains the mind in analysis, argumentation, and strategic thinking. In a court where every conversation could be politically significant, intellectual ability becomes a form of currency, extending influence subtly yet effectively. Even seemingly boring or repetitive tasks serve an instructional purpose. Sorting ceremonial items, recording events, or observing the daily routines of officials teaches attention to detail and patience. Wu Zetian's early experiences demonstrate that power is often built through the accumulation of small, consistent actions. Knowledge of how the court functions, who holds influence, and how ceremonies are conducted lays the groundwork for later strategic intervention. This is the essence of palace education, immersion in the mechanisms of power. not only in grand decisions but also in the minutiae of everyday life. Social dynamics are another critical component. The court is not simply hierarchical, it is a web of interpersonal relationships, rivalries, and alliances. Concubines, officials, and eunuchs form networks of influence that can determine promotion, punishment, or favor. Wu Zetian observes patterns of loyalty and betrayal, learning to identify allies and potential threats, understanding human behavior, how pride, fear, ambition, and morality intersect. With protocol is as important as knowledge of literature or ritual. The social lessons, often delivered subtly through observation, form a central part of the education in palace life. One striking aspect of this environment is the blend of monotony and high stakes. Much of life revolves around repetitive ceremonies, study, and service. Yet each repetition reinforces knowledge, hones skills, and sharpens awareness. A misstep may seem minor, but in context, it can have serious consequences for rank, favor, or even survival. Wu Zetian's ability to thrive within this rhythm demonstrates a combination of patience, intelligence, and adaptability. She learns that mastery of routine is not dull, it is foundational to influence. Her education also includes exposure to the administrative machinery of the empire. Records of appointments, tax collection, legal cases, and correspondence circulate through the palace. While much of this is handled by eunuchs or officials, concubines with ambition can gain access to information through observation or in direct channels. Understanding bureaucracy, the flow of orders, the hierarchy of reporting, and the mechanisms of enforcement equips Wu Zetian to engage with governance more effectively once she rises in rank. Knowledge of these systems becomes a strategic advantage, allowing her to anticipate consequences, shape decisions, and exercise influence behind the scenes. By the end of this section, it becomes clear that life in the Tang imperial court is a comprehensive education in both discipline and power. Wu Zetian's immersion in ritual, etiquette, intellectual cultivation, and bureaucratic observation equips her with skills that extend far beyond the palace walls. She learns patience, strategic thinking, and the importance of perception, all while operating within the constraints imposed by status, gender, and hierarchy. Even the mundane, repetitive aspects of court life, serving meals, observing ceremonies, or following schedules, become tools for learning and influence. As we pause here, consider this: in a world of strict hierarchies, limited freedoms, and seemingly endless repetition, how do ordinary actions accumulate into extraordinary influence? For Wu Zetian, the answer lies in meticulous attention, strategic patience, and the ability to perceive opportunity where others see only constraint. The question remains: how does a woman living under these restrictions translate this deep, almost invisible knowledge into tangible authority that reshapes an empire? By the time Wu Zetian had become fully immersed in the rhythms of the palace, she was not merely participating in rituals or mastering etiquette, she was observing the very structure of power itself. The Tang imperial court functioned as a vast, intricate machine, with each individual playing a specific role. Officials carried out administrative duties, eunuchs control access and communication, and palace staff maintained the daily operations of an empire in miniature. Understanding how these components interacted was essential for anyone aspiring to influence, and Wu Zetian's genius lay in her capacity to perceive both the overt and subtle workings of authority. Officials in the Tang court were organized according to rank, responsibility, and proximity to the emperor. Their duties ranged from overseeing taxation and land distribution to managing legal disputes and military campaigns. Though they held formal power, their influence depended heavily on perception, alliances, and imperial favor. Wu Zetian observed not just their formal interactions, but their habits, loyalties, and ambitions. Who sought the emperor's attention too aggressively? Who remained cautious, calculating, or deferential? Each behavior carried signals about potential allies or threats. Eunuchs played an equally crucial role, often underestimated by historians unfamiliar with palace life. These men, who had been castrated and trained for service in the imperial household, controlled the flow of information. They managed correspondence, recorded court events, and acted as intermediaries between the emperor and officials. Their loyalty was often transactional, tied to access, reward, or punishment. Wu Zetian's keen awareness of their influence allowed her to cultivate discreet eyes, ensuring that messages favorable to her were delivered and that intelligence about rival factions reached her. In essence, eunuchs became a channel through which she could extend her influence without overt confrontation. Palace staff, while lacking formal political authority, also contributed to the flow of information. Servants, clerks, and attendants observed patterns, whispered rumors, and noted minor infractions. Wu Zetian recognized the strategic value of these eyes and ears, understanding that knowledge was as vital as official rank. By paying attention to these subtle networks, she could anticipate moves by rivals, set the moods of officials, and detect potential threats before they became crises. Daily life among these groups was governed by rigid schedules and bureaucratic routines. Officials presented reports, held audience sessions, and participated in deliberation, while eunuchs managed logistics, ceremonial protocols, and correspondence. The timing and sequencing of actions were critical. A delayed report, a misfiled document, or a poorly timed intervention could alter perceptions of competence and loyalty. Wu Zetian, in her quiet observation, began to internalize the rhythms of decision-making. She learned not only what was done, but when and how it was done, and how timing could enhance or undermine authority. Wu Zetian's understanding of bureaucracy extended beyond observation. She began to engage strategically, subtly influencing appointments and decisions through careful advice or written memorials. Her interventions were always framed as concern for the states or guidance for the emperor, maintaining the appearance of propriety while quietly shaping outcomes. In many cases, her influence was invisible to others, yet it could determine appointments, promotions, and policy decisions. The skill lay in acting without overstepping, in guiding without appearing. To control a delicate balance she would perfect over time. The culture of secrecy and controlled access in the palace reinforced the value of information. Knowledge of discussions, intentions, and alliances was carefully guarded, and misinformation could be weaponized. Wu Zetian, by contrast, cultivated networks to gather intelligence, learning, to assess the credibility of reports, and to detect subtle manipulation. Her understanding of information as a form of power became foundational to her rise. Every detail, from a delayed memorandum to a hesitant burr, was a clue about the dynamics of authority, loyalty, and ambition. Rituals, which might seem mundane from the outside, were also arenas for influence. Ceremonial seating, the order of participation, and the timing of offerings conveyed messages about rank and favor. Wu Zetian observed and internalized these signals, understanding that influence could be signaled as effectively through ritual as through conversation. By aligning herself with virtue, decorum, and precise timing, she built an image of competence and moral authority that reinforced her growing political weight. An often overlooked aspect of palace observation is the role of human psychology. Wu Zetian became adept at reading subtle cues, hesitation in speech, changes in posture, the choice of words, or even facial expression. Officials might present a unified front in formal sessions, but behind the scenes, loyalties shifted and ambitions collided. Eunuchs, too, could appear neutral while pursuing self-interest. Wu Zetian learned to detect inconsistencies, to weigh competing narratives, and to anticipate moves before they occurred. Her capacity for psychological insight amplified the advantage she gained from procedural and ritual knowledge. The repetition inherent in palace routine also served as education. Daily cycles of ceremony, reporting, and administration reinforced hierarchical awareness. Observing which officials succeeded and which faltered revealed patterns of reward and punishment, loyalty and disloyalty. Wu Zetian noted that small missteps could compound into larger consequences, teaching her that influence often emerges from consistent competence rather than dramatic action. Even ordinary, seemingly boring events, reviewing reports, attending ceremonies, or observing staff interactions became laboratories for learning the mechanics of power. This period also reveals Wu Zetian's capacity for long-term strategic thinking. She was not content to respond to events reactively. She planned intervention, cultivated allies, and positioned herself to exploit opportunities. For instance, by subtly guiding the emperor's decisions, she could ensure that officials loyal to her gained positions of influence, creating a self-reinforcing network of authority. Simultaneously, rivals could be marginalized gradually, often without direct confrontation, reducing the risk of backlash. In this way, she transformed observation into deliberate action, a hallmark of her political methodology. Wu Zetian's immersion in the palace bureaucracy highlights a key principle. Power is not only exercised through formal authority, but also through information, perception, and strategic positioning. By mastering these elements, she became a central figure in the court's decision-making processes long before she assumed full sovereign authority. Her understanding of the human and institutional dynamics of the palace allowed her to navigate challenges that would have overwhelmed less perceptive actors. By the end of this section, it is clear that the Tang court functioned as both a microcosm of imperial governance and a training ground for those capable of subtle influence. Wu Zetian's study of officials, eunuchs, and staff networks demonstrates the extraordinary value of patient observation, disciplined learning, and strategic patience. She is learning the hidden levers of power, the rhythms of authority, and the intricacy of human behavior, all elements that will enable her unprecedented rise. As we pause here, one question emerges. If knowledge, observation, and patient strategy can allow someone to navigate an entire imperial bureaucracy, what happens when opportunity aligns with preparation? For Wu Zetian, the next stages of her life will test not only her intellect and patience, but also her ability to translate subtle influence into decisive authority, a transformation that will redefine the limits of female power in imperial China. By the late 65s, Wu Zetian had become an accomplished observer and strategist within the Tang court. She had learned the patterns of officials, the hidden power of eunuchs, and the significance of routine, ritual, and bureaucracy. Yet, knowledge alone was not enough. The palace imposed strict restrictions that constrained movement, speech, and even thought. Every action, no matter how small, was subject to scrutiny. Clothing, posture, seating, and timing all reflected rank and status. In this environment, asserting influence required not overt confrontation but subtle manipulation, precise timing, and an acute awareness of human psychology. Restrictions in the palace were both physical and social. Certain chambers and corridors were forbidden to all but the highest-ranking individuals. Access to the emperor was strictly controlled. Even minor interactions with officials or servants could carry risks. Wu Zetian quickly understood that visibility needed to be carefully managed. Too much exposure could provoke jealousy or suspicion. Too little, and one could be overlooked entirely. She learned to operate within these constraints, using permitted spaces and sanctioned interactions to cultivate influence quietly. Rituals, while seemingly repetitive, became instruments of authority. Participation, seasonal ceremonies, ancestral offerings, and religious observances allowed Wu Zetian to display competence, virtue, and moral alignment with both Confucian and Buddhist ideals. Each ritual was an opportunity to reinforce her image as a disciplined, intelligent, and morally upright figure. She learned to time gestures, recitations, and movements precisely so that her participation subtly demonstrated authority without overtly challenging hierarchy. Even the placement of hands, the bow of the head, and the pace of step carried meaning, signaling discipline and propriety to observers. The emperor's favor remained the most critical element in asserting influence. Wu Zetian knew that shaping his perceptions was as important as any formal action. Through measured counsel, strategic interventions, and discreet advice, she could guide decisions, appointments, and policies without overtly claiming authority. Her interventions were often framed in the language of moral duty or concern for the empire, disguising personal ambition as devotion to governance. In doing so, she cultivated an image of indispensability, gradually expanding her sphere of influence. At the same time, Wu Zetian carefully neutralized potential rivals. Palace life was rife with competition. Other consorts, high-ranking officials, and even members of the imperial family could threaten her position. She relied on subtlety rather than confrontation, using the bureaucracy and ritual hierarchy to her advantage. Promotion or demotion of officials, strategic appointments, and the timing of reports allowed her to marginalize threats indirectly. Her mastery of perception ensured that these actions appeared natural or in line with the emperor's will, reducing the risk of backlash. The constraints imposed on women in Tang China were significant. While the dynasty allowed some mobility and influence, female authority was exceptional and often contested. Wu Zetian turned these restrictions into strategic advantages. By presenting herself as modest, disciplined, and observant, she avoided provoking the suspicion that might accompany more overt displays of ambition. Her very compliance with court norms and rituals became a tool of influence. She gained trust precisely because she appeared to operate within the rules, all while quietly extending her authority. Buddhism played a pivotal role in her strategy. The religion offered moral and philosophical justification for her action, creating a framework in which female authority could be legitimized. Wu Zetian commissioned sutras, patronized monks, and framed her guidance as aligned with divine and ethical principles. These religious interventions were not mere decoration. They were calculated instruments for reinforcing her authority, appealing to both officials and the broader populace. By blending morality, religion, and strategy, she created a unique foundation for power that transcended gender norms. The daily routines of the palace reinforced her strategic advantage by attending rituals, observing officials, reviewing reports, and interacting with eunuchs and staff. Wu Zetian maintained a constant flow of information. She could anticipate political moves, detect shifts in alliances, and respond before threats materialized. This continuous observation transformed routine, often mundane tasks into opportunities for influence. Each repetition of ceremony or review of documents reinforced her understanding of the court's rhythms, allowing her to predict outcomes and subtly shape events. By the end of this period, Wu Zetian had fully mastered the tools available to her. Knowledge, observation, strategic intervention, ritual participation, and perception management were now fully integrated into her approach. She could operate effectively within constraints, convert routine into intelligence, and use subtlety to expand her influence. The palace, once a world of restriction, had become a stage for exercising power. Yet, even as she excelled, the ultimate question of full sovereignty remained unresolved. Could a woman truly claim the mandate of heaven and rule an empire historically dominated by men? Wu Zetian's influence as empress and co-ruler was formidable, but the leap from advisor and co-ruler to emperor would require not just strategy and intellect, but decisive action that challenged centuries of precedent. The tension between opportunity and risk set the stage for the most remarkable political transformation in Chinese history. As we leave this section, one can reflect on a crucial insight. The mundane, repetitive, and highly constrained life of the imperial court was in reality a crucible for extraordinary political skill. Wu Zetian's rise demonstrates that influence often emerges from careful observation, disciplined practice, and the strategic use of every available tool, even in situations where personal freedom is limited. The next step in her story will show how these lessons, accumulated over years of patient strategy, enabled her to seize the ultimate power and reshape the Tang Dynasty. To understand Wu Zetian's rise to empress, one must first immerse oneself in the intricate political environment of the Tang Dynasty during the mid-7th century. The court was a delicate web of alliances, rivalries, and ever-shifting loyalties, where power was exercised both overtly through official channels and covertly through influence, persuasion, and careful manipulation. For a woman, even one of noble birth and intelligence, advancing within this structure required a combination of subtlety, strategy, and patience. Wu Zetian's rise was not sudden or accidental. It was the result of years of preparation, observation, and a keen understanding of human behavior and institutional mechanics. When Emperor Gaozong ascended the throne in 649 CE following the death of his father Taizong, the political landscape was already complex. Gaozong inherited not only a flourishing empire but also a court divided by factionalism. Officials, ministers, and military commanders each sought influence, forming alliances based on shared interests, family ties, and ambition. The bureaucracy was hierarchical but permeable, with opportunities for advancement often dependent on the favor of the emperor, the strategic support of intermediaries, and the ability to navigate court protocol. This environment, while rigid, contained spaces for strategic actors to extend influence quietly yet effectively. Wu Zetian returned to the palace at this juncture, initially as a concubine of Gaozong. Having spent years in a Buddhist convent, her exile had been, in the eyes of many, a setback, but in reality it had deepened her understanding of power, patience, and perception. During her time at the convent, she studied Buddhist texts in depth, refined her understanding of Confucian propriety, and observed the subtle machinations of palace politics from a distance. This period of reflection and study allowed her to enter the court with a unique combination of moral legitimacy, intellectual authority, and strategic foresight. The first challenge in Wu Zetian's path to empress was navigating the existing hierarchy of consorts. Empress Wang, Gaozong's official wife, held the highest female rank, while numerous other consorts competed for attention and influence. To rise above them, Wu Zetian relied not on confrontation but on subtle demonstration of virtue, intelligence, and competence. She composed poetry, engaged in learned conversation, and displayed meticulous attention to ritual, gradually distinguishing herself from her peers. Her behavior suggested both modesty and capability, a combination that drew the emperor's attention without provoking suspicion or envy from other court figures. Even before formal recognition, Wu Zetian demonstrated an instinct for strategic alliances. She cultivated relationships with eunuchs, palace attendants, and lower-ranking officials, understanding that influence often flows through networks rather than direct authority. By quietly building these connections, she positioned herself to extend her reach beyond the emperor's private chambers. Each interaction was carefully measured, reinforcing her image of intelligence, propriety, while gathering insight into the ambitions and loyalties of others. The court was also shaped by ritualized patterns that could be leveraged for influence. Ceremonies, seasonal events, and religious observances were not merely symbolic. They were stages where rank, favor, and competence were displayed and assessed. Wu Zetian became adept at participating in these rituals with precision, signaling both discipline and virtue. Her knowledge of timing, posture, and sequence of actions allowed her to demonstrate authority subtly, influencing perception without overt assertion. The skill was crucial in a system that prized propriety. The appearance of competence and moral alignment could be more potent than direct action. By the mid-65s, Gaozong's attention increasingly favored Wu Zetian. Contemporary account note her ability to engage in intelligent discourse on governance, literature, and ritual propriety. She advised the emperor on matters of state subtly yet persuasively, often framing suggestions as moral guidance or concern for the empire. This approach allowed her to expand influence while maintaining the appearance of deference, an essential balance in a court wary of ambitious women. At the same time, Wu Zetian's understanding of human nature became central to her rise. She observed which consorts sought attention through flamboyance or intrigue, which officials acted cautiously, and which eunuchs could be persuaded to serve her interests. This keen perception allowed her to navigate a court filled with potential rivals. For example, she could anticipate jealousy, redirect gossip, or manage the timing of her interventions to maximize effect while minimizing risk. Her influence grew not through confrontation, but through subtle manipulation, leveraging both knowledge and patience. A critical turning point in her ascent involved her engagement with succession politics. Emperor Gaozong's health was often fragile, creating uncertainty about the future. Wu Zetian recognized that controlling the succession, ensuring that her children or loyal allies occupied key positions would be essential to consolidating her authority. She began to promote officials loyal to her, subtly discredit rivals, and maintain the emperor's confidence in her judgment. By aligning the bureaucratic machinery with her strategic objectives, she laid the foundation for eventual political dominance. Even seemingly mundane activities contributed to her rise. Reviewing documents, attending ceremonies, observing staff, and engaging in intellectual discourse were not idle pursuits. They were exercises in understanding and shaping the court's dynamics. Through consistent attention to detail, she cultivated an extraordinary awareness of both people and procedure. Knowledge of the palace's rhythms and bureaucratic flows enabled her to anticipate problems, exploit opportunity, and maintain influence despite structural constraints. By the late 65s, Wu Zetian had moved from observer to active participant in governance. She influenced appointments, advised on policy, and managed relationships with officials and courtiers. Her presence was increasingly indispensable to Emperor Gaozong, and her reputation for competence and virtue reinforced her growing authority. Yet, the formal title of Empress remained held by Wang, and the palace still contained potential rivals, from ambitious consorts to wary ministers. The path ahead required not only strategy but courage, calculation, and timing quality that Wu Zetian had cultivated in the years of careful observation and patient learning. Her rise, thus, was not sudden but the result of an extended process of preparation, strategic intervention, and subtle influence. Each ritual participated in, each alliance cultivated, and each insight into human behavior strengthened her position. The ordinary routines of palace life, reading, observing, performing ceremonies, and attending to administrative detail, became the foundation of extraordinary political skill. As Section 1 concludes, the question emerges: how does an intelligent and patient consort transform influence into formal authority? Wu Zetian's journey is poised at a critical juncture, where her accumulated knowledge, strategic relationships, and moral legitimacy will converge to challenge established hierarchies and set the stage for her unprecedented elevation to empress. By the mid-65s, Wu Zetian's presence in the Tang court had evolved from that of an intelligent observer to a subtle but increasingly influential political actor. Yet the court was far from static. Beneath the surface of ritual, ceremony, and bureaucratic procedure lay a dense web of ambition, rivalry, and factional intrigue. Officials vied for appointments, consorts maneuvered for favor, and eunuchs maintained networks of power, both visible and hidden. Wu Zetian's challenge was to navigate this environment with precision, advancing her position without provoking opposition, while simultaneously preparing for opportunities that could elevate her to the pinnacle of female authority in China. Her first strategic maneuver involved the subtle management of rival consorts. Empress Wang, while officially Gaozong's spouse, lacked Wu Zetian's combination of intelligence, patience, and political awareness. Where other consorts might compete through flamboyance or personal appeal, Wu Zetian cultivated an image of virtue, propriety, and moral alignment with both Confucian and Buddhist principles. She avoided direct confrontation, instead allowing small missteps by her rival to accumulate, slowly undermining their positions in the emperor's perception. By doing so, she created an environment where her own influence appeared natural, earned, and morally justified. Another layer of strategy involved alliances with eunuchs, palace attendants, and officials. These actors controlled access, communication, and information flow within the palace. Eunuchs, for example, were responsible for delivering messages, documenting proceedings, and managing the emperor's immediate household. By cultivating their loyalty through favors, patronage, or demonstration of competence, Wu Zetian ensured that information favorable to her reached the emperor, while intelligence about potential rivals could be filtered or intercepted. This network allowed her to extend her influence beyond visible channel of authority, creating a subtle but effective system of indirect control. Wu Zetian's understanding of bureaucracy also proved invaluable. The Tang court was organized hierarchically, but promotions, appointment, and policy influence depended heavily on imperial favor. By observing patterns of loyalty and competence among officials, she could strategically recommend appointments subtly, discredit rivals, or advise the emperor in ways that shaped the composition of the bureaucracy. These actions were always framed as concern for the empire rather than personal ambition, maintaining the appearance of propriety while consolidating power behind the scenes. Religious and cultural frameworks were also leveraged as tools of influence. Wu Zetian had spent years studying Buddhism, which provided both philosophical grounding and practical legitimacy for female authority. She commissioned sutras, supported monks, and presented herself as a moral and spiritual guide. By framing her counsel and interventions within religious and ethical principles, she enhanced her authority while mitigating potential criticism for overstepping traditional gender boundaries. The combination of moral, religious, and intellectual justification made her rise not only acceptable but desirable to a court sensitive to propriety and virtue. The consolidation of influence required patience and timing. Historical records suggest that Wu Zetian carefully monitored the emperor's health and the shifting dynamics of court factions. She waited for moments of vulnerability, Gaozong's illness, missteps by rivals, or bureaucratic inefficiencies to act decisively. Each intervention was calculated, a well-timed recommendation, a subtly framed critique, or a strategic promotion could shift the balance of power. By integrating observation, knowledge of human behavior, and procedural expertise, she was able to convert opportunity into tangible influence. Conflict management was another essential skill. The court was rife with jealousy, rumor, and intrigue. Wu Zetian became adept at redirecting potential threats and neutralizing rivals without open confrontation. For example, she could frame a rival's error as concern for the emperor or the empire, subtly shifting blame or criticism while avoiding overt hostility. In other cases, she leveraged ritual and ceremony to reinforce hierarchy, ensuring that perceived moral authority bolstered her own position. These actions illustrate her capacity to blend subtlety with decisive action, a hallmark of her political methodology. Succession politics were central to her strategy. Emperor Gaozong's health issues created uncertainty about the future of the dynasty. Wu Zetian recognized that securing the path for her children or loyal allies was critical to consolidating long-term authority. She promoted supporters within the bureaucracy, subtly undermined rival, and carefully positioned her sons within the imperial hierarchy. These maneuvers required careful calculation. Too aggressive a push could provoke resistance, but inaction risked marginalization. Her success depended on patience, timing, and an extraordinary understanding of the interwoven personal and institutional dynamics of the court. Her intellectual and cultural acumen played a role in legitimizing her influence. She engaged in scholarly discourse, composed poetry, and demonstrated knowledge of history, philosophy, and ritual propriety. These displays were not mere decoration. They provided concrete evidence of her competence and moral suitability for higher authority. In a society where the ideal ruler was expected to be educated, virtuous, and capable, Wu Zetian's intellectual accomplishment reinforced her growing political power and provided justification for future claims to sovereignty. By the late 65 hours, Wu Zetian had moved beyond mere influence to become a central actor in Tang politics. She had identified allies, neutralized rivals, and strategically aligned her image with virtue, intelligence, and moral authority. Her rise illustrates the intricate interplay of observation, timing, networks, and cultural legitimacy in a court where overt displays of ambition could be dangerous. She had turned the constraints of palace life rituals, hierarchy, and gender norms into instruments for consolidating power. Yet challenges remained. The palace was never static, and potential opposition from officials, family members, and rival consorts could emerge at any moment. Consolidation of influence was only the first stage. The next challenge was transformation from influential consort to recognized empress. Achieving this required not only skill and strategy but decisive action that would confront the existing hierarchy directly. How would Wu Zetian make this leap without destabilizing the court or provoking insurmountable resistance? The answer lay in a combination of careful planning, subtle intervention, and seizing moments of opportunity, a process that would forever change the course of the Tang Dynasty. By the late 65s, Wu Zetian had meticulously cultivated influence, mastered palace dynamics, and aligned herself with both moral and intellectual authority. Yet the ultimate prize, the formal title of Empress, remained occupied by Empress Wang. Achieving this elevation required not only strategic acumen, but also the ability to exploit opportunity with precision. Wu Zetian's rise to Empress represents a turning point in Chinese history, illustrating the extraordinary intersection of patience, intelligence, and decisive action in navigating political hierarchies that were often hostile to women. The first step in her strategy was to undermine Empress Wang without overt confrontation. Historical accounts suggest that Wu Zetian leveraged a combination of ritual, perception, and moral argumentation. She highlighted perceived deficiencies in Empress Wang's conduct, framing them in terms of imperial propriety rather than personal ambition. Reports were prepared carefully, emphasizing moral or administrative concerns, subtly painting the current empress as unfit while positioning herself as virtuous and competent. These maneuvers relied on timing and discretion. A misstep could have provoked backlash from the court or the emperor. Simultaneously, Wu Zetian cultivated favor with Emperor Gaozong. Through her counsel on governance, her knowledge of ritual, and her intellectual accomplishments, she became indispensable. The emperor increasingly relied on her judgment in both state affairs and court administration. By aligning her interests with his and presenting herself as a stabilizing force in governance, she gradually shifted the balance of influence. Gaozong's growing trust in her judgment provided the crucial foundation for her eventual elevation to empress. Key to her success was the careful orchestration of alliances within the court. Wu Zetian identified officials, eunuchs, and palace attendants whose loyalty could be secured through patronage, moral appeal, or strategic positioning. These allies became conduits for information, channels for influence, and buffers against opposition. In this way, she extended her reach beyond the immediate confines of the emperor's attention, ensuring that every potential obstacle could be managed with discretion. Even officials who might have opposed her were monitored and subtly neutralized through strategic appointments, promotions, or reassignment. Religious symbolism and moral authority played a vital role. Wu Zetian invoked Buddhist principles, emphasizing moral conduct, karmic consequence, and divine sanction. She positioned herself as a morally upright figure whose guidance was aligned with both the emperor's welfare and the broader stability of the empire. This appeal to ethical and spiritual authority allowed her to justify actions that might otherwise have seemed audacious, framing the transition of power as a matter of propriety and destiny rather than ambition alone. In 655 CE, the culmination of these strategies unfolded. Empress Wang was formally deposed, accused of improprieties and misconduct, while Wu Zetian was elevated to the position of empress. Historical records note that the transition was executed with careful attention to ritual, symbolism, and perception. By maintaining appearances of propriety, Wu Zetian minimized the risk of immediate rebellion or backlash. Her elevation was not merely a personal triumph. It was a carefully orchestrated assertion of legitimacy, supported by allies, ritual, and moral justification. Even after securing the title of empress, her work was far from complete. Authority had been formalized, but the consolidation of power required ongoing management of court factions, officials, and succession politics. Wu Zetian continued to cultivate alliances, monitor potential rivals, and leverage her position in state affairs. Her influence extended into appointments, policy guidance, and the administration of justice, demonstrate that the title of empress was not merely ceremonial, but a platform for substantive authority. One of the most remarkable aspects of her rise is the subtlety with which it was achieved. Rather than relying solely on force or intimidation, Wu Zetian integrated observation, patience, ritual mastery, intellectual authority, and moral legitimacy into a coherent strategy. Her ascent illustrates that in hierarchical systems, influence often grows through meticulous accumulation of knowledge, alliances, and perception management, rather than through overt confrontation. The palace, with all its restrictions and ceremonies, became both a laboratory and a stage for her extraordinary political skill. Her elevation also reshaped perceptions of female authority in China. While exceptions had existed historically, Wu Zetian's rise demonstrated that women could exercise significant power through intellect, strategy, and moral positioning. It challenged traditional hierarchies and set a precedent for the exceptional but tangible possibility of female rulership, showing that authority could be exercised subtly and effectively even in male-dominated structures. As she settled into her role as empress, Wu Zetian faced the ongoing challenge of consolidating power for the long term. The Tang court remained a place of ambition, intrigue, and shifting alliances. Maintaining authority required vigilance, strategic foresight, and continuous cultivation of both perception and loyalty. Her ascent was not the end of a journey, but the beginning of a period of active governance, where every decision, alliance, and intervention would shape the future of the empire. By the end of this section, it is clear that Wu Zetian's path to impress was a masterclass in political strategy, patient observation, careful cultivation of influence, and decisive action converged to achieve unprecedented authority. Her rise illustrates how knowledge, timing, and perception can transform constraint into opportunity and routine observation into political power. Yet even with the title of empress, a final question remained. Could she translate influence into sovereign authority, ruling not just as the emperor's partner but as the sole sovereign of China? The answer would unfold in the coming decades, as Wu Zetian would redefine the boundary of female authority and leave an indelible mark on the history of the Tang Dynasty. Upon ascending to the position of empress, Wu Zetian faced a reality that was both extraordinary and daunting: the task of governing one of the most powerful and populous empires in the world. The Tang Dynasty, at its height, encompassed vast territories with diverse populations, regional military garners, and a sprawling bureaucracy. Central authority depended on intricate networks of officials, rigorous system of taxation, legal codes, and a delicate balance of local and imperial power. For Wu Zetian, the challenge was not merely ceremonial, it was a practical and continuous exercise in statecraft, requiring keen observation, administrative skill, and the ability to translate authority into effective governance. The Tang bureaucracy was structured according to Confucian ideals, emphasizing hierarchy, moral propriety, and merit-based administration. At the top were the emperor and empress, followed by the central secretariats and ministries responsible for personnel, revenue, rights, defense, and justice. Officials were organized into multiple levels, from high ministers to provincial governors and local administrators. Each position carried specific responsibilities, but influence was also heavily dependent on favor, alliances, and the ability to navigate political networks. Mismanagement, inefficiency, or favoritism could ripple across the empire, undermining both authority and stability. Wu Zetian's first task was to understand these structures in depth. Having been immersed in the palace for decades, she possessed intimate knowledge of bureaucratic flows, ritual, and the subtle dynamics of court politics. She now applied this knowledge systematically, reviewing appointments, examining policies, and observing the performance of officials. Her approach was methodical. By understanding the inner workings of each ministry, she could identify weaknesses, recognize opportunities for reform, and ensure that imperial directives were executed efficiently. Centralization was a key principle in her governance. The Tang bureaucracy had traditionally delegated significant authority to regional military governors, known as jidushi, who often acted with considerable autonomy. While this system allowed for efficient local administration, it also posed risks. Regional power could challenge central authority, leading to rebellion or fragmentation. Wu Zetian pursued policies that reinforced imperial oversight carefully, balancing the delegation of authority with mechanisms of accountability. She monitored provincial reports, rotated officials to prevent entrenched local power, and used patronage to align regional administrators with the central government. Meritocracy became a crucial tool in her administration. Wu Zetian emphasized the recruitment of officials based on ability rather than solely on family status or traditional privilege. She expanded the imperial examination system, a process by which candidates were evaluated on literary skill, administrative knowledge, and moral character. By promoting capable individuals from diverse backgrounds, she not only improved bureaucratic efficiency but also cultivated a network of loyal, competent officials who owed their positions to her favor and judgment. This approach reinforced both governance and personal influence, creating a bureaucracy that was more directly responsive to imperial authority. Policymaking under Wu Zetian combined pragmatism with moral justification. She intervened in areas such as land distribution, taxation, and legal enforcement, seeking to enhance both state stability and her legitimacy. For instance, policies that promoted equitable taxation or reduced corruption were framed as fulfilling Confucian ideals of benevolent governance. By demonstrating competence and moral integrity, Wu Zetian reinforced the perception of her authority as not only rightful but also beneficial to the empire. These actions strengthened her political position while improving the functionality of the state. Her governance style also emphasized surveillance and intelligence. Wu Zetian relied on eunuchs, palace staff, and a network of inspectors to monitor officials and detect misconduct. Reports were carefully evaluated, and corrective measures were applied to maintain discipline and prevent abuse of power. While this system could be feared as intrusive, it ensured accountability, allowed the central government to respond quickly to potential instability. Wu Zetian's strategic use of information reinforced her control without requiring overt display of coercion, demonstrating her skill in combining subtle influence with effective administration. The empress also demonstrated foresight in succession planning and management of court factions. She monitored the ambitions of ministers, eunuchs, and provincial governors, intervening when alliances threatened central authority. By promoting loyal individuals and strategically marginalizing potential rivals, she created a governance network that both reinforced her rule and enhanced bureaucratic stability. Her policies were incremental but cumulative, reflecting a long-term vision of centralized, efficient, and accountable government. Education and intellectual engagement remained integral to her administration. Wu Zetian personally reviewed memorials, consulted scholars, and composed written directives that balanced practical governance with moral and philosophical reasoning. Her decisions were informed by historical precedent, Buddhist and Confucian ethics, and careful analysis of bureaucratic performance. This approach reinforced her authority, as she demonstrated not only political acumen but also moral and intellectual legitimacy, a combination that few rulers, male or female, could match. Even seemingly routine administrative tasks carried strategic weight. Reviewing appointments, auditing reports, or attending ceremonial proceedings provided opportunities to assess loyalty, competence, and alignment with imperial policy. Wu Zetian understood that effective governance required continuous engagement, attention to detail, and integration of observation with decisive action. Her meticulous approach ensured that authority was exercised not only through decree, but also through the consistent and reliable functioning of the state machinery. By the end of this section, it is clear that Wu Zetian's early governance relied on a synthesis of observation, strategic appointments, policy intervention, and moral authority. She transformed the experience gained during her years in the palace into active management of the empire. Centralization, meritocracy, and accountability became tools not only of administration, but also of consolidating her influence. The seemingly mundane routines of bureaucracy, reviewing reports, monitoring officials, ensuring procedural compliance, became instruments of power, demonstrating that effective governance often emerges from disciplined attention to structure, process, and human behavior. As we pause here, a key question arises. In an empire as vast and complex as Tang China, how does a single ruler balance the exercise of authority with the autonomy of regional governors, the ambitions of officials, and the demands of daily administration? For Wu Zetian, the answer will lie in a combination of reform, oversight, and strategic intervention, policies that will redefine central authority and leave a lasting imprint on Chinese governance. By the time Wu Zetian had consolidated her position as empress, she faced the ongoing challenge of converting influence into effective governance. The Tang Dynasty was vast, with a population numbering in the tens of millions and territory stretching from the edges of the Gobi Desert to the fertile plains of the south. Central authority had to navigate the realities of regional autonomy, local interests, and the ambitions of officials, while simultaneously maintaining legitimacy in the eyes of the emperor, scholars, and common people. Wu Zetian's approach to governance combined administrative reform, strategic policy-making, and a careful balance of oversight and delegation, a blend that strengthened central control while promoting efficiency and loyalty. A key focus was bureaucratic reform. Wu Zetian expanded the imperial examination system, refining the selection of officials to prioritize ability, moral character, and loyalty. Candidates were tested on literary skill, knowledge of historical precedent, administrative competence, and adherence to Confucian ethics. By broadening access to talented individuals from outside traditional elite families, Wu Zetian not only improved the quality of governance, but also cultivated a cadre of officials whose loyalty derived directly from her favor and opportunities. This meritocratic system reduced the dominance of entrenched aristocratic families, ensuring that central authority could rely on capable, competent administrators rather than inherited status alone. Centralization of authority was also pursued through the rotation and reassignment of officials. Regional governors, or jidushi, had historically wielded considerable autonomy, creating potential challenges to imperial control. Wu Zetian implemented a system in which officials were rotated regularly between posts, limiting the accumulation of local power and preventing the emergence of independent regional factions. By aligning loyalty to the central government rather than local base of influence, she strengthened the coherence of imperial authority. Rotation also ensured that the bureaucracy remained flexible and responsive, while officials were continuously evaluated for competence and adherence to imperial policy. Her approach to taxation and land management further reinforced central authority. Wu Zetian implemented policies to ensure more equitable collection of revenue, reduced corruption, and maintained accurate census records. These measures were critical not only for fiscal stability but also for demonstrating the government's legitimacy in the eyes of the population. Efficient tax collection allowed the empire to fund military campaigns, infrastructure projects, and public works, while reducing grievances that could foment rebellion. By linking administrative competence with perceived moral responsibility, Wu Zetian strengthened both governance and her own authority. Legal reforms and enforcement were another pillar of her strategy. The Tang legal code was sophisticated and codified, but its application could be inconsistent depending on local officials or regional customs. Wu Zetian emphasized rigorous oversight, employing inspectors and intelligence networks to monitor adherence to law. Officials who abused power or failed in their duties were subject to corrective measures, ranging from reassignment to demotion or punishment. By ensuring consistent legal enforcement, she reinforced central authority and created a perception of fairness and competence in governance. Strategic use of information became a hallmark of her administration. Wu Zetian maintained networks of eunuchs, palace staff, and loyal officials to monitor activity across the empire. Reports of misconduct, inefficiency, or rebellion were evaluated carefully, enabling swift and targeted intervention. This system functioned as an early form of administrative intelligence, allowing the central government to maintain control even across distant provinces. The ability to act decisively based on accurate information enhanced both the effectiveness of governance and the perception of her authority. Wu Zetian also leveraged symbolic and cultural measures to reinforce her policies. Religious patronage, particularly of Buddhism, played a dual role. It justified imperial authority and promoted moral legitimacy. She commissioned temples, sponsored sutras, and endorsed moral teachings that aligned with her vision of governance. These acts were not merely ceremonial. They strengthened the perception of the central government as morally grounded and culturally authoritative, reinforcing loyalty and compliance among officials and subjects alike. Education and intellectual engagement continue to be integral to policymaking. Wu Zetian personally reviewed memorials, debated with scholars, and issued edicts that reflected both practical administration and philosophical reasoning. Her decisions were informed by historical precedent, moral principle, and pragmatic governance consideration. By integrating intellectual rigor with policy implementation, she enhanced both the efficiency and legitimacy of the bureaucracy. The consequences of her reforms were visible in multiple domains. Provincial administration became more accountable, tax collection more consistent, and appointments more merit-based. The central government's ability to enforce law, regulate local authorities, and manage resources was strengthened. At the same time, these reforms reinforced loyalty to Wu Zetian personally, as officials recognized that competence and adherence to central directives were rewarded, while disloyalty or incompetence carried consequences. Her influence extended beyond the palace into every level of administration, illustrates how careful policy making could translate into tangible authority. Even in routine bureaucratic operations, Wu Zetian's strategic mind was evident. Reviewing reports, auditing officials, and overseeing ceremonial compliance were not mundane chores. They were mechanisms for reinforcing observation, evaluating loyalty, and ensuring alignment with imperial objectives. The seemingly repetitive nature of administration became a tool for consolidating authority. Attention to detail revealed patterns of behavior and opportunities for strategic intervention. By the end of this section, it is clear that Wu Zetian's governance relied on an intricate balance of policy reform, centralization, surveillance, and moral authority. Her ability to convert palace knowledge and political insight into practical administration allowed her to maintain control over a vast empire, while simultaneously legitimizing her unprecedented position as a female ruler. Centralization, meritocracy, and careful oversight were not merely bureaucratic principles, they were instruments of power that reinforced her personal authority and reshaped the structure of the Tang government. As we pause here, one question emerges. In an empire as vast and complex as Tang China, how far can centralization go without stifling local initiative? And how does a ruler balance control with the need for a flexible, responsive administration? For Wu Zetian, the answer would unfold in a series of policies and reforms that would consolidate her authority and leave a lasting mark on Chinese governance. As Wu Zetian settled into her role as empress and de facto ruler, the focus of her governance shifted from observation and incremental reform to consolidation of power and systemic implementation of policies that would define her reign. Her approach combined administrative efficiency, political maneuvering, and moral legitimacy to strengthen central authority while ensuring the empire a stability. Over time, these measures transformed the bureaucracy, reshaped the relationship between central and local government, and established a model of governance that would influence China for generations. A defining feature of Wu Zetian as consolidation was the strategic integration of loyalty and merit. While merit-based appointments had already expanded under her guidance, she refined the system to reinforce allegiance to the central government and, by extension, to her personally. Officials who demonstrated competence and fidelity were promoted rapidly, while those who resisted or faltered faced reassignment, demotion, or dismissal. This system ensured that provincial governors, ministers, and lower-level administrators were not only capable but aligned with imperial objectives. By linking opportunity and advancement to loyalty and performance, Wu Zetian created a bureaucracy that was both effective and personally invested in her authority. Surveillance and intelligence remained central to her consolidation strategy. Wu Zetian maintained extensive networks of informants, inspectors, and loyal eunuchs who reported on the conduct of officials across the empire. These mechanisms allowed her to detect corruption, prevent rebellion, and identify emerging factions before they posed threats. Information was power. Knowledge of local conditions, administrative lapses, and official ambitions enabled her to intervene decisively, reinforcing both the central government as authority and her personal influence. By making observation systematic and strategic, she turned bureaucracy itself into an instrument of control. Land and taxation policy further strengthened the empire's cohesion. Wu Zetian implemented measures to standardize revenue collection, reduce local corruption, and ensure equitable distribution of resources. By maintaining accurate population and land records, she enhanced the state's fiscal capacity and demonstrated responsiveness to subjects' needs. These reforms were framed not only as practical governance but also as moral responsibility, reinforcing the perception of a benevolent and capable ruler. Citizens and officials alike recognized the central government's authority and fairness, which helped stabilize regions far from the capital. The empress also addressed succession and continuity in governance. By promoting loyal officials and carefully positioning her children in the line of succession, Wu Zetian ensured that power would remain aligned with her vision of centralization and competence. She strategically cultivated ministers and governors who could be trusted to support her directives, creating an administrative network that extended the reach of her authority into every corner of the empire. The interplay of loyalty, merit, and oversight created a durable system that reduced the risks of factionalism or rebellion. Wu Zetian's legal and administrative reforms had enduring impact. She standardized procedures across ministries, clarified legal codes, and enhanced mechanisms of accountability. Officials could be evaluated consistently, and policies could be implemented with a degree of uniformity that had previously been difficult to achieve. By reinforcing procedural clarity and administrative predictability, she strengthened the legitimacy of the central government while simultaneously embedding her personal authority within the machinery of the state. Even routine bureaucratic operations, reporting, auditing, and ceremonial compliance became avenues for demonstrating and enforcing central control. Her strategic use of culture and religion also reinforced governance. Wu Zetian's patronage of Buddhism and the production of religious texts served multiple purposes, legitimizing her authority, promoting moral values, and creating symbolic cohesion within the empire. By linking governance to ethical and spiritual frameworks, she framed her administration as both competent and morally justified. This dual strategy, pragmatic policymaking combined with moral and religious legitimacy, enhanced compliance among officials and subjects while reinforcing her unprecedented authority as a female ruler. The cumulative effect of Wu Zetian's reforms was a Tang Dynasty characterized by stronger centralization, a meritocratic bureaucracy, and a well-monitored provincial administration. Regional governors were less autonomous, officials were more accountable, and the flow of information from the provinces to the capital allowed for rapid response to potential instability. Her policies ensured that the emperor, or in this case, herself, remained the definitive source of authority, with both moral and practical legitimacy reinforcing her decisions. Wu Zetian's consolidation of power also illustrates the delicate balance between oversight and flexibility. While she strengthened central control, she allowed competent officials the autonomy to manage local affairs, provided they adhered to imperial directives. This approach prevented the bureaucracy from becoming overly rigid, maintaining responsiveness while ensuring loyalty. The interplay of observation, accountability, and delegated authority became a hallmark of her illustration, demonstrating a nuanced understanding of governance in a complex, vast empire. Even in the most mundane administrative tasks, Wu Zetian's influence was evident. Reviewing memorials, auditing appointments, attending ceremonies, or monitoring provincial reports were not mere formality. They were instruments for reinforcing her authority, assessing loyalty, and ensuring alignment with imperial policy. By converting routine bureaucracy into mechanisms of observation and control, she created a system in which both authority and administration were inseparable from her personal influence. By the end of her consolidation, Wu Zetian had achieved something unprecedented. She had transformed her position as empress into direct and enduring authority over the Tang Dynasty. Her reforms strengthened central government, enhanced administrative efficiency, and ensured loyalty throughout the empire. More than that, she demonstrated that governance could be both effective and morally justified, combining practical administration with intellectual, ethical, and religious legitimacy. As we leave this section, one is left with a profound insight: Wu Zetian, as governance shows that true power extends beyond titles and ceremonies. It emerges from the strategic use of knowledge, observation, loyalty, and moral authority applied patiently, systematically, and decisively. The reforms and centralization she implemented did not merely reinforce her personal power, they reshaped the structure of the Tang state itself, leaving a legacy that would endure long after her reign. Yet, a final question remains. In consolidating centralized authority and reshaping the bureaucracy, what were the long-term social and political consequences for the Tang Dynasty? While her policies strengthened the empire, they also concentrated power in ways that would influence succession, factionalism, and governance for decades to come, a balance that every ruler must navigate, and one that Wu Zetian exemplified with extraordinary skill. Wu Zetian's reign was not only defined by administrative and bureaucratic reforms, but also by the careful management of the Tang military. While she is often remembered for her unprecedented position as the only female emperor of China, her ability to secure, maintain, and utilize military power was equally critical to her authority. The Tang military was vast, composed of standing armies, regional garrisons, and elite units, yet its strength depended on both central coordination and the loyalty of commanders. In a sprawling empire with diverse populations, distant borders, and persistent threats, effective military strategy was inseparable from political power. The Tang military system combined professional soldiers, conscripts, and regional militias, organized under a structure that mirrored the central bureaucracy. The jidushi, or military gunners, held significant authority in their provinces, controlling local troops, fortifications, and logistics. While this system allowed for flexible regional defense, it also created potential challenges. Governors with strong military power could resist imperial directives or become the nucleus of rebellion. Wu Zetian recognized that maintaining authority required balancing the empowerment of military leaders with careful oversight, ensuring loyalty to the central government without stifling operational effectiveness. The empire faced both internal and external threats. Border regions, particularly along the northwestern frontiers, were vulnerable to nomadic incursions and raids from Turkic and other steppe groups. Internally, political rivalries and the ambitions of military governors posed the risk of rebellion. Wu Zetian understood that effective defense depended not only on troop strength and fortifications, but also on intelligence, logistics, and strategic coordination between the central court and regional commanders. Her approach to military management reflected the same careful observation, planning, and strategic foresight that had characterized her rise in the palace. Wu Zetian took a systematic approach to consolidating military authority. First, she emphasized loyalty and oversight. Commanders were selected and evaluated based on their competence and allegiance to the central government. By rotating appointments and maintaining direct channels of communication with key generals, she prevented the accumulation of independent power that could challenge the throne. Inspectors and intelligence networks monitored troop movements, readiness, and discipline, ensuring that provincial forces remained aligned with imperial priorities. This dual focus on loyalty and operational capability allowed her to manage a large, decentralized military effectively. Strategic deployment of forces was central to her defense policy. Wu Zetian reviewed the positioning of garrisons along vulnerable borders, ensuring that troops were stationed in regions where threats were most likely. Logistics and supply chains were carefully managed, as the movement of troops over long distances depended on accurate records of provisions, transport, and terrain conditions. By integrating administrative competence with military planning, she ensured that the army could respond rapidly to threats while minimizing the risk of disorder or inefficiency. Intelligence and information gathering were crucial components of her military strategy. Wu Zetian relied on a combination of scouts, local informants, and reports from loyal officials to monitor both external threats and potential internal dissent. Early detection of rebellion or incursion allowed the central government to act decisively, preventing small problems from escalating into significant crises. Her strategic use of information mirrored the principles she had applied in governance, observation, timely intervention, and the integration of moral, political, and practical considerations. Beyond logistics and oversight, Wu Zetian also engaged in active military planning. While she did not personally lead troops into battle, she participated in the formulation of campaigns, the appointment of commanders, and the evaluation of battlefield reports. Her decisions were informed by historical precedent, knowledge of terrain and enemy capabilities, and careful analysis of available resources. By taking an active role in military strategy, she reinforced both central authority and the perception of competence, demonstrating that her rule was grounded not only in ceremony and bureaucracy, but also in practical command over the empire's defense. Internal discipline and control were equally important. Wu Zetian implemented measures to prevent corruption, desertion, or inefficiency within the military. Officers were held accountable for the performance and conduct of their units. Loyalty was continuously reinforced through rewards, promotions, and recognition. These measures created a professionalized force that was responsive to central authority, reducing the risk of insubordination or factionalization. The integration of discipline, loyalty, and operational oversight allowed the Tang military to function as both a defensive instrument and a political stabilizer. The empress also understood the symbolic importance of military success. Victories against border incursions or internal uprisings not only secured the empire physically but also reinforced her authority politically. Each campaign, even minor skirmishes, served as a demonstration of competence and legitimacy. In this way, military management was inseparable from governance, diplomacy, and the consolidation of power, reflecting Wu Zetian's holistic understanding of statecraft. By the end of this section, it is clear that Wu Zetian's approach to the military mirrored her broader style of governance. Systematic observation, strategic planning, careful oversight, and integration of moral and political authority. She transformed the Tang military from a decentralized network of regional forces into a coordinated instrument of imperial power, aligning loyalty, competence, and discipline with central objectives. The military was not simply a tool of defense. It became an essential pillar of her authority, reinforcing her legitimacy and supporting the broader stability of the empire. As we conclude section 1, one question emerges. How does a ruler maintain control over PRW? How does a ruler maintain control over PRW? By the midpoint of Wu Zetian's reign, the Tang Empire faced a complex array of military challenges. While her internal governance had strengthened the central bureaucracy and consolidated loyalty, among officials, the empire's borders remained dynamic and at times precarious. Nomadic groups from the north and northwest, including Turkic and Tuju tribes, exerted pressure on frontier regions, while distant southern provinces occasionally threatened rebellion. Wu Zetian's approach to military affairs combined proactive campaigns, defensive fortifications, strategic appointments, and a sophisticated understanding of logistics and intelligence, a combination that ensured both the survival and expansion of the empire. One notable aspect of her military strategy was the emphasis on frontier defense. Northern and western borderlands were vulnerable to raids requiring a system of garrisons, watchtowers, and rapid response forces. Wu Zetian evaluated the placement of troops based on geography, trade routes, and historical patterns of conflict. Commanders were rotated periodically to prevent local power from becoming entrenched, ensuring that loyalty remained tied to the central government rather than to regional interests. Supply lines were meticulously planned, with provisions, transport, and local knowledge carefully coordinated to support both defensive and offensive operations. Intelligence gathering became a cornerstone of her frontier policy. Scouts, informants, and local networks provided timely information on enemy movements, intentions, and alliances. Wu Zetian relied on reports from these sources to make informed decisions, directing force to where they were most needed and anticipating potential incursions before they escalated. Her integration of surveillance into military planning reflected the same principles she had applied in governance, observation, analysis, and intervention based on accurate information. Strategic campaigns during her reign were not merely reactive but often preemptive. Wu Zetian authorized expeditions to pacify border regions, secure trade routes, and assert imperial authority over potentially unstable territories. While she rarely led troops personally, she played an active role in planning, appointing commanders, and evaluating battlefield reports. Decisions regarding troop movements, supply management, and engagement strategies were informed by historic precedent, intelligence reports, and the political implications of military success or failure. By participating directly in strategic decision-making, she ensured that military power reinforced both the security of the empire and her personal authority. Her appointment of military governors was particularly strategic. Loyal and capable generals were stationed in key regions to maintain control, respond rapidly to threats, and enforce imperial policies. Wu Zetian carefully balanced the empowerment of these leaders with mechanisms for accountability, ensuring that authority was sufficient for operational effectiveness, but not so great as to challenge central control. Rotation of appointments, oversight by central inspectors, and integration into intelligence network minimized the risk of insubordination while maintaining the operational readiness of forces. A critical feature of Wu Zetian's military policy was the professionalization and discipline of troops. Units were regularly inspected, officers held accountable for the conduct of their subordinates, and desertion or corruption was punished decisively. Loyalty was reinforced through promotions, rewards, and recognition, creating a military culture aligned with central authority. By combining discipline, merit-based promotion, and surveillance, Wu Zetian ensured that the army operated efficiently and remained politically reliable, a rare and difficult balance in an era when military power could easily challenge imperial control. Wu Zetian's campaigns also extended into diplomacy and strategic alliances. She leveraged relationships with neighboring states and tribes to secure borders, negotiate peace, or extract tribute. Military action was carefully calibrated. It was used when necessary but supported by negotiation, intelligence, and calculated show of force. By integrating diplomacy into military strategy, she reduced the frequency of conflict while projecting imperial authority over distant regions, further reinforcing the perception of a strong and capable central government. One example of strategic success was her handling of the northeastern frontier. Threats from Turkic tribes required rapid mobilization, coordinated logistics, and decisive command. Wu Zetian ensured that competent generals were in place, that intelligence network provided timely warnings, and that troops were adequately supplied and trained. The result was a series of defensive and preemptive operations that secured the region, maintained trade routes, and demonstrated the Tang government's capacity to project power effectively beyond the capital. These successes reinforced both military and political stability, consolidating her rule. Internally, military oversight served as a tool of political control by monitoring provincial commanders and integrating them into a network of accountability. Wu Zetian mitigated the risk of rebellion or factionalism. Military authority was thus inseparable from administrative governance. Commanders were loyal to the emperor because their positions, promotions, and responsibilities were tied directly to central oversight. In this way, the military both defended the empire and reinforced her personal authority, creating a dual mechanism of security and control. By the end of Section 2, it is evident that Wu Zetian's military strategy was comprehensive, combining frontier defense, proactive campaigns, disciplined and loyal troops, and strategic appointments. Her approach illustrates that military power, when managed with intelligence, oversight, and strategic planning, can serve both as a tool of defense and a reinforcement of political authority. The Tang military under Wu Zetian became a system in which operational effectiveness, loyalty, and administrative integration were mutually reinforcing, ensuring stability and projecting the emperor's or empress's power across vast territories. As this section closes, one critical question arises. How does a ruler ensure that military success reinforced political authority without creating new centers of power that could challenge the throne? Wu Zetian's answer lay in her meticulous integration of oversight, loyalty, and strategic placement of commanders, a balance that would define her military legacy and secure the Tang Empire's borders during a period of both internal consolidation and external threats. By the later years of her reign, Wu Zetian had transformed the Tang military from a collection of regional forces into a cohesive instrument of imperial authority. Her strategies combined disciplined troops, loyal commanders, intelligence networks, and centralized oversight, allowing the empire to respond decisively to threats both internal and external. Yet her approach was not limited to logistics or organization. It was deeply political, reflecting the inseparable connection between military power and sovereign authority. Each campaign, each appointment, and each strategic decision was calculated to reinforce her control while ensuring the long-term stability of the empire. One of the most significant aspects of her military rule was the careful orchestration of campaigns along the northern and northwestern frontiers. These regions were prone to incursions from Turkic and Tuju tribes whose mobility and familiarity with the terrain posed constant challenges. Wu Zetian ensured that commanders in these regions were not only capable tactically but also politically reliable. Her instructions emphasized both operational objectives and the importance of maintaining allegiance to the central authority. By integrating loyalty into the chain of command, she prevented frontier forces from becoming independent centers of power, a common source of instability in Chinese history. Campaigns were meticulously planned, with attention to supply lines, terrain, and coordination between multiple units. Wu Zetian relied on detailed intelligence reports, sometimes dispatched from far-flung frontier posts, to anticipate enemy movements and allocate resources efficiently. Strategic decisions were informed by historical precedent, geographic considerations, and the political implications of military success. For example, a victory against raiders could secure trade routes, demonstrate the empire's strength, and reinforce loyalty among provincial officials all at once. Military action was thus a multifaceted tool, achieving security while enhancing political legitimacy. The empress also emphasized defensive infrastructure. Fortifications, watchtowers, and strategically located garrisons were reinforced and carefully monitored. Soldiers were trained not only for combat but also for the maintenance and defense of critical positions. This preparation allowed the Tang Empire to respond quickly to incursions and to deter potential aggression by projecting the image of readiness and competence. By combining infrastructure, discipline, and strategic oversight, Wu Zetian transformed the military into a stabilizing force rather than a reactive instrument. Internal threats were addressed with equal care. Military governors and regional commanders were rotated and monitored to prevent the consolidation of independent power. Inspections, intelligence reports, and selective promotions ensured that loyalty was tied directly to the central government. Wu Zetian understood that unchecked military authority could become a source of rebellion, and she mitigated this risk by integrating oversight with opportunity, rewarding competence and loyalty while penalizing disloyalty or incompetence. This balance maintained operational effectiveness without sacrificing political control. Several notable campaigns during her reign illustrate the sophistication of her approach. On the northeastern frontier, Turkic incursions were met with a combination of preemptive deployments, fortified positions, and careful coordination of multiple armies. Intelligence networks provided timely warnings, allowing generals to respond decisively. The outcome was not only military success, but also the stabilization of key trade routes and the demonstration of imperial authority, a signal to both allies and potential adversaries that the Tang government maintained both capability and control. In the southern provinces, potential rebellions were addressed through a mixture of diplomacy, military presence, and strategic appointment. Local militias were integrated into the imperial system, with officers carefully monitored for loyalty. Wu Zetian's direct intervention in personnel decisions ensured that military strength did not become a challenge to her rule but instead served as a mechanism for maintaining stability. The integration of diplomacy and military oversight reflects her holistic understanding of power. Force alone was insufficient. Authority had to be managed through alliances, perception, and careful planning. Wu Zetian's control over the military also reinforced her broader political authority. By demonstrating competence in defense and strategic management, she validated her unprecedented role as a female sovereign. The perception of capability, reinforced by both victories and organizational success, bolstered her legitimacy in the eyes of officials, generals, and the populace. Military power was thus both practical and symbolic, reinforcing her ability to govern a vast and diverse empire effectively. Discipline, loyalty, and information management remained central to her strategy. Troops were held accountable, commanders were evaluated continuously, and intelligence flowed systematically from frontier posts to the capital. This integration of military and administrative oversight created a system in which every element of defense, troops, infrastructure, commanders, and information networks was aligned with central authority. The result was a military that was not only capable in combat, but also politically reliable, reinforcing the stability of Wu Zetian's reign. By the end of Section 3, it is evident that Wu Zetian's military strategies were far more than tactical maneuvers or defensive measures. They represented an inseparable integration of force, governance, and authority. Through disciplined troops, loyal and strategically placed commanders, intelligence networks, and carefully coordinated campaigns, she secured the empire's borders, maintained internal stability, and reinforced her personal legitimacy. Military power under Wu Zetian was a tool of governance as much as a mechanism of defense, reflection of her extraordinary ability to blend strategy, oversight, and political acumen. As this story concludes, one can reflect on the enduring impact of her military policies. Wu Zetian demonstrated that the effective use of military power requires not only skill in warfare but also strategic oversight, intelligence, loyalty management, and integration with civil governance. Her approach ensured that the Tang Empire remained secure, stable, and unified during her reign. Yet the lingering question remains: how does one balance the use of military force to secure authority without creating potential rivals who could challenge the throne? Wu Zetian's answer lay in oversight, rotation, and loyalty, a lesson that resonates throughout the annals of imperial history. Wu Zetian's reign was remarkable not only for political and military achievement, but also for her strategic use of religion to consolidate power. In a society deeply influenced by Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist traditions, moral authority and legitimacy were often intertwined with spiritual endorsement. For a woman seeking unprecedented sovereignty in a male-dominated hierarchy, religion offered a crucial instrument, a framework through which her rule could be justified, her policies legitimized, and her authority recognized as both divinely sanctioned and morally upright. Buddhism, in particular, became a cornerstone of Wu Zetian's approach to legitimacy. By the 7th century, the religion had taken deep root in China, offering moral teachings, philosophical reasoning, and ritual practices that extended beyond individual piety to social and political life. Wu Zetian aligned herself with Buddhist principles, presenting her rule as consistent with moral order, karmic justice, and the protection of the people. She commissioned sutras, supported monasteries, and promoted the study of Buddhist texts, framing her decisions as an extension of ethical governance. One of her most significant religious innovations was the promotion of the concept that she was divinely chosen to rule. Historical records describe how Buddhist prophecies and texts were interpreted or, in some cases, selectively presented to suggest that a woman would ascend to the throne for the benefit of the empire. By connecting her authority to spiritual destiny, Wu Zetian transformed potential social resistance into moral validation. What might have been dismissed as audacious or improper in Confucian terms was reframed as fulfillment of a cosmic mandate sanctioned by divine will. Taoism, with its emphasis on harmony, ritual, and the natural order, also played a role in her religious strategy. Wu Zetian supported Taoist institutions, commissioned rituals, and incorporated Taoist symbolism into court ceremonies. These acts reinforced the perception that her governance was in accordance with cosmic and natural laws, aligning human authority with spiritual and ritual propriety. By engaging with both Buddhism and Taoism, she created a religiously pluralistic foundation that enhanced her legitimacy across diverse social groups. Monastic institutions and religious officials were integral to her strategy. Buddhist monks and Taoist priests were not merely spiritual actors, they were also influential in social, educational, and political spheres. Wu Zetian cultivated alliances with religious leaders, commissioning works and supported their communities, which in turn fostered loyalty and amplified her moral authority. These networks provided both symbolic and practical reinforcement reinforcement of her policies, extending the reach of her influence beyond the immediate confines of the palace and bureaucracy. Pilgrimages, temple constructions, and public religious ceremonies were carefully orchestrated to demonstrate imperial virtue. Wu Zetian understood that visible acts of piety could shape perceptions, instill moral authority, and reinforce the idea of the emperor or empress as a benevolent, divinely sanctioned ruler. By linking spiritual observance to governance, she transformed religion into both a tool of social cohesion and an instrument for reinforcing political legitimacy. Her use of religious texts also served strategic purposes. Certain sutras and prophecies were highlighted to support her authority, while interpretations of ritual or scripture were framed to emphasize moral guidance and the alignment of her policies with divine will. This selective and calculated engagement with religion allowed Wu Zetian to project authority that transcended ordinary political legitimacy, framing her sovereignty as both ethically and spiritually necessary for the stability of the empire. Wu Zetian's approach to religious influence was meticulous. It required careful observation of public perception, precise commissioning of text and ceremonies, and strategic engagement with influential spiritual actors. Religion was not a mere accessory to her rule. It was an essential mechanism for reinforcing authority, mitigating resistance, and shaping the ideological framework through which her unprecedented position as a female sovereign could be accepted. Even routine religious activities carried political weight. Sponsoring a temple, commissioning a ritual, or endorsing a monk's interpretation of scripture was not only an act of piety but also a demonstration of control over cultural and moral discourse. By integrating these practices into governance, Wu Zetian ensured that her authority was continuously reinforced through both visible and symbolic channels. By the end of this section, it is clear that Wu Zetian's early engagement with religion was both deliberate and multifaceted. She understood that legitimacy was not simply a matter of titles or force, but also of perception, morality, and spiritual sanction. Buddhism and Taoism provided frameworks through which she could justify her rule, shape social and moral norms, and extend her influence beyond the bureaucratic and military spheres. Religion became, in effect, a pillar of power supporting governance, reinforcing authority, and creating moral and cosmic justification for her unprecedented position. As this section closes, a central question emerges. How can spiritual authority be leveraged to reinforce political legitimacy without alienating traditional elites or the population? For Wu Zetian, the answer would involve careful interpretation of doctrine, strategic patronage of religious institutions, and the orchestration of rituals and symbols, a delicate balance between morality, politics, and perception that would define much of her reign. By the middle of her reign, Wu Zetian had recognized that religious influence was not merely symbolic, it was an active instrument for consolidating authority, shaping public perception, and ensuring loyalty among officials. Both Buddhism and Taoism provided structures through which she could legitimize her unprecedented rule. As the only woman emperor in Chinese history, her policies were designed to integrate spiritual authority into governance, aligning religious institutions, doctrines, and rituals with the political objectives of the central government. A cornerstone of her religious strategy was the systematic patronage of Buddhist institutions. Wu Zetian sponsored the construction of temples and monasteries across the empire, especially in strategic regions where loyalty and moral authority were vital. These institutions served multiple purposes. They offered spiritual guidance to the populace, acted as centers of learning, and reinforced imperial influence in distant provinces. By financing and supervising these establishments, Wu Zetian embedded imperial authority within the spiritual and social fabric of the empire. Wu Zetian also leveraged Buddhist texts and prophecies to reinforce the perception of divine sanction. One prominent example was the use of the Great Cloud Sutra, which was interpreted to predict that a female ruler would bring prosperity and stability to China. This interpretation was widely publicized, supporting the narrative that Wu Zetian's ascension was not only legitimate but also predestined. By aligning her rule with religious prophecy, she transformed potential skepticism into moral and spiritual justification, reducing resistance among officials and the broader population. Religious officials were carefully cultivated as both allies and instruments of authority. Buddhist monks and Taoist priests were granted privileges, appointments, and patronage, creating a network of loyalty that extended into the provinces. These religious figures were influential in their communities, capable of shaping opinion, mediating disputes, and reinforcing moral norms. Wu Zetian's strategic support of these leaders ensured that religious institutions functioned as extensions of her governance, reinforcing obedience and stabilizing regions far from the capital. Daoist institutions were also central to her religious policy. Wu Zetian commissioned rituals, supervised Taoist temples, and integrated Taoist symbolism into court ceremonies. Taoist cosmology emphasized harmony with the natural and cosmic order, which she used to frame her rule as aligning with universal principles. By invoking both Buddhist and Taoist traditions, she created a multi-layered ideological foundation, allowing her authority to be perceived as both morally justified and cosmically ordained. Education and scholarship within religious contexts were encouraged, further strengthening her position. Wu Zetian promoted the study of Buddhist texts, supported translation efforts, and commissioned commentaries that highlighted moral and ethical teachings consistent with her governance. Religious scholarship reinforced central authority by framing imperial directives as morally grounded, providing intellectual justification for policies, and fostering loyalty among educated elites. Religious festivals and ceremonies became platforms for demonstrating imperial virtue. Public celebrations, temple dedications, and ritual observances were orchestrated to showcase her piety, benevolence, and moral leadership. These events were more than displays, they were carefully calculated interventions in the cultural and ideological life of the empire. They reinforced her presence, shaped perception, and connected the ruler's authority with visible demonstrations of morality and ritual propriety. Wu Zetian's integration of religion into governance extended to law and moral policy. Buddhist principles of karmic consequence, moral rectitude, and the protection of the innocent were invoked to justify administrative decisions, legal reforms, and punishment. By aligning secular authority with spiritual moral frameworks, she enhanced both the legitimacy and effectiveness of governance. Officials and subjects were reminded that obedience to imperial authority was not only politically prudent but also morally imperative. Her religious policies were also adaptive. Wu Zetian responded to local variations in belief, regional power dynamics, and shifting political circumstances. In areas where Taoism was particularly influential, she emphasized Taoist rituals. In regions where Buddhism had a stronger presence, she promoted Buddhist teachings. This flexibility allowed her to maintain a perception of moral and spiritual legitimacy across the diverse cultural landscape of the Tang Empire, reinforcing loyalty and minimizing resistance. By the end of Section 2, it is clear that Wu Zetian's religious strategies were sophisticated, multidimensional, and deeply integrated with political governance. Buddhism and Taoism were not merely tolerated or patronized, they were harnessed as instruments of power, shaping ideology, reinforcing morality, and legitimizing authority. Through patronage, ritual, scholarship, and strategic alliances with religious leaders, she created a network of moral and spiritual reinforcement that extended the reach of the central government, bolstered loyalty, and legitimized her unprecedented position as a female sovereign. As this section closes, one central question arises: how does a ruler maintain the balance between religious influence and political authority, ensuring that spiritual institutions reinforce rather than challenge imperial power? Wu Zetian's approach suggests a careful integration of patronage, oversight, and strategic ritual, a delicate balance that underpinned her enduring authority and reshaped the moral landscape of the Tang Dynasty. By the final decades of her reign, Wu Zetian had transformed the interplay between religion and political authority in China. Her careful integration of Buddhism, Taoism, and ritual observance into the machinery of governance had achieved multiple objectives, legitimizing her unprecedented role as a female emperor, reinforcing loyalty among officials and regional leaders, and shaping the moral and cultural perception of the Tang state. Yet, her religious strategies were not static, they evolved in response to political needs, social expectations, and the complex religious landscape of the empire. One of the most striking outcomes of her religious policies was the enduring perception of her as a divinely sanctioned ruler. By commissioning sutras, supporting Buddhist scholarship, and promoting religious prophecies, Wu Zetian framed her authority as predestined and morally justified. This perception extended beyond the court to the provinces, where temples, monasteries, and religious ceremonies reinforced the narrative of cosmic and moral legitimacy. Even decades later, historians noted the influence of these religious endorsements in shaping the acceptance of her unprecedented sovereignty. Buddhist institutions, in particular, became tightly intertwined with governance. Wu Zetian's patronage strengthened monastic networks, turning temples into centers of learning, culture, and social influence. Monks and abbots were not only spiritual authorities but also advisors, educators, and intermediaries between local populations and the central government. By integrating these institutions into her administration, she extended imperial influence into regions that were geographically distant or culturally diverse, creating a network in which religion functioned as both moral compass and instrument of political control. Taoism continued to complement these strategies. Through ritual observances, celestial symbolism, and sponsorship of Taoist temples, Wu Zetian aligned her authority with cosmic and natural law. Taoist rituals reinforced the perception of harmony between the ruler and the universe, legitimizing her policies and reinforcing social stability. The combination of Buddhist and Taoist support created a pluralistic religious framework that was difficult to contest, as resistance could be framed as both morally and cosmically improper. Religion, festivals, and public ceremonies remained central to her consolidation of power. These events were carefully orchestrated to showcase imperial virtue, promote moral teachings, and reinforce obedience. Participation of religious figures in court rituals symbolically linked spiritual and political authority, while public observance strengthened loyalty and social cohesion. Wu Zetian's use of ritual demonstrates how visible, repeated, and carefully managed religious practice could reinforce governance on both symbolic and practical levels. Her policies also created a precedent for the ideological role of religion in Chinese imperial governance. By aligning Buddhist and Taoist moral frameworks with state administration, Wu Zetian established a model in which spiritual authority was harnessed to support political legitimacy. This approach influenced subsequent emperors, who recognized the value of religious endorsement in reinforcing authority, stabilizing governance, and shaping public perception. Her reign demonstrated that control over moral and spiritual narrative could be as powerful as control over bureaucracy or the military. Yet Wu Zetian's engagement with religion was not without tension. Confucian scholars and traditional elites sometimes resisted her use of spiritual authority, seeing it as a challenge to established social hierarchies and patriarchal norms. She navigated these tensions through careful patronage, selective interpretation of texts, and the integration of ritual and moral teaching into everyday governance. By demonstrating competence, moral propriety, and cosmic legitimacy, she minimized opposition while reinforcing her authority in a way that transcended gender expectation. Her religious legacy extended beyond immediate political control. Temples she sponsored, sutras she commissioned, and monasteries she patronized became enduring centers of cultural and intellectual life. Buddhist scholarship flourished, Taoist rituals were codified, and both traditions became more closely intertwined with state ideology. Wu Zetian's reign illustrates how religious engagement can leave lasting cultural impact, shaping not only governance, but also the moral and intellectual contours of society for generations. By the end of her reign, Wu Zetian had demonstrated a remarkable ability to integrate religion into statecraft. Buddhism and Taoism were not merely tools for public display, they were instruments of governance, legitimacy, and social cohesion. Religious authority reinforced bureaucratic control, military loyalty, and the perception of moral and cosmic order. In doing so, she reshaped the ideological foundation of the Tang Empire, leaving a legacy that extended far beyond her lifetime. As we conclude this story, one final question remains: how can spiritual authority be harnessed to reinforce political power without compromising the autonomy or influence of religious institutions themselves? Wu Zetian's solution: strategic patronage, selective interpretation, and integration into governance, provides a nuanced lesson on the delicate balance between morality, ritual, and political authority. Her reign shows that religion, when wielded thoughtfully, can serve as both a shield and a pillar of imperial power, legitimizing rule in ways that transcend the ordinary bounds of politics and governance. Wu Zetian's reign was not solely defined by military conquests, religious patronage, or bureaucratic reform. It was also shaped by her mastery of the intricate and often treacherous world of court politics. The imperial court was a complex ecosystem of power, alliances, and influence in which eunuchs, ministers, royal family members, and scholars all competed for favor and authority. For a woman ascending to the highest position in a traditionally patriarchal hierarchy, navigate this environment required extraordinary political acumen, foresight, and adaptability. At the heart of court politics were the eunuchs, whose roles extended far beyond palace service. Eunuchs controlled access to the emperor or empress. In Wu Zetian's case, managed internal palace communications and often supervised security, finances, and ceremonial function. Their proximity to the sovereign gave them significant influence over policy, appointments, and information flow. Wu Zetian understood that eunuchs could be both allies and potential threats. She cultivated loyalty through rewards, careful appointments, and selective empowerment, while simultaneously monitoring their actions to prevent the accumulation of independent power. Factionalism was another defining feature of the court. Ministers, military governors, and scholars often formed competing groups, each seeking to advance their agendas, secure influence, or protect regional and familial interests. Wu Zetian's approach to factionalism was both strategic and decisive. She encouraged competition among factions to prevent any single group from dominating the court, while also promoting loyalty and merit-based appointment. By balancing rivalry with oversight, she maintained central authority while ensuring that bureaucratic expertise and capability were rewarded. Information management was central to her control over the court. Wu Zetian implemented networks of informants and secret reports, often through eunuchs and loyal officials, to monitor the actions, loyalties, and ambitions of ministers and palace attendants. Regular reporting allowed her to intervene before rivalries escalated into open conflict, manage succession issues, and maintain a clear understanding of the political landscape. The integration of intelligence into court management reinforced both her authority and her ability to anticipate challenges. Wu Zetian's relationship with the scholar officials, steeped in Confucian tradition, required careful negotiation. Confucian ideals emphasized male leadership, filial piety, and hierarchical order, all of which complicated her unprecedented rule as a female sovereign. She engaged with Confucian scholars through policy discussion, ceremonial recognition, and select promotion, demonstrating both respect for their expertise and dominance over institutional authority. By balancing engagement with assertion, she maintained credibility while navigating an ideological environment that could have undermined her legitimacy. Ceremonial control was another subtle but critical element of court politics. Wu Zetian carefully managed rituals, audiences, and court etiquette to reinforce hierarchy, assert authority, and shape perception. Each ceremony, from the daily court meeting to grand imperial observances, was an opportunity to display competence, moral authority, and control over the administrative apparatus. This meticulous attention to ritual underscored the interconnectedness of symbolism, governance, and political stability in the Tang court. Appointments and promotions were highly strategic. Wu Zetian frequently rotated officials to prevent entrenched networks of influence, promoted loyalists over traditional elites, rewarded merit as a demonstration of competence and fairness. This approach minimized the power of any single faction, reinforced central authority, and encouraged a sense of dependency on imperial favor. Officials learned that success in the court depended on alignment with the empress's policy and approval rather than purely on inherited status or familial connections. Eunuchs played an additional role as intermediaries between factions and the sovereign. Wu Zetian leveraged their access to the inner court to monitor rivalry, disseminate directives, and manage sensitive information. Their dual position as servants and observers made them essential for maintaining control, particularly in an environment where direct oversight was impossible across all levels of the palace and bureaucracy. By balancing empowerment with vigilance, she created a loyal network capable of both communication and enforcement. Court intrigue, while sometimes subtle, could have profound consequences. A poorly managed rumor, alliance, or ceremonial misstep could shift influence among factions, or even provoke rebellion. Wu Zetian's skill lay in her ability to anticipate and manipulate these dynamics. She cultivated loyalists, neutralized rivals, and used both rewards and punitive measures to maintain balance. By treating political maneuvering as both a practical and psychological endeavor, she ensured that authority remained centralized while factions competed under conditions favorable to her rule. By the end of this section, it is evident that Wu Zetian's mastery of court politics relied on observation, strategic alliances, rotation of officials, and careful integration of eunuch influence. She transformed potential threats into mechanisms of control, ensuring that factionalism, rivalry, and ambition reinforced rather than undermined her authority. The court, with all its complexities, became both a site of administration and a tool of governance, demonstrating the subtle power of perception, loyalty, and strategic management. As this section closes, one lingering question emerges: how can a ruler maintain authority in a court filled with competing factions, ambitious officials, and influential intermediaries without alienating key actors or provoking rebellion? Wu Zetian's approach suggests that a delicate balance of oversight, rotation, reward, and strategic empowerment can transform potential instability into a reinforcing structure of loyalty and control, a lesson she applied with extraordinary skill. By the middle of her reign, Wu Zetian had fully recognized that the Tang court was as much a battlefield of influence as the empire was a field of military campaigns. Eunuchs, ministers, royal relatives, and scholar officials were engaged in a constant struggle for access, recognition, and power. Court intrigue was subtle, often conducted through whispers, ceremonial maneuvering, and strategic appointments, yet its consequence could shift policy, affect loyalty, and even threaten the stability of the empire. Wu Zetian's genius lay in her ability to observe, anticipate, and manipulate these dynamics, converting potential threats into instruments of control. Factionalism was omnipresent. Ministers aligned by family connections, regional loyalty, or shared philosophical perspectives often formed informal blocs, competing for influence over appointments, policy decisions, and the distribution of favors. The scholar officials, steeped in Confucian tradition, were particularly sensitive to her position as a female ruler, viewing it as a potential challenge to normative hierarchies. Military governors, with authority over regional troops, could leverage their control of forces to influence decisions or challenge rivals. Wu Zetian's management of these competing groups required constant vigilance, strategic insight, and calculated intervention. Eunuchs, positioned as a center of palace operations, became both allies and key instruments of influence. Their proximity to the empress allowed them to relay information about the ambitions and alliances of court factions. Wu Zetian cultivated their loyalty through wards, selective promotions, and privileges, create a network of intermediaries capable of monitoring rivalries and enforcing her directives. In many cases, eunuchs were the first to alert her to the subtle emergence of political tension, giving her the ability to act decisively before conflicts escalated. One of Wu Zetian's key strategies was the selective rotation and promotion of officials. By periodically transferring governors, ministers, and palace administrators, she prevented entrenched factions from consolidating independent power. Promotions were awarded based on loyalty, competence, and alignment with her vision, rather than purely on seniority or family pedigree. This method encouraged officials to focus on service to the empress rather than factional competition, subtly transforming rivalry into dependence on imperial favor. The empress also used punishment as a calculated instrument. Public demotions, dismissals, or forced retirements served not only as disciplinary measures but also as warnings to other officials about the consequences of disloyalty or factional overreach. At times, Wu Zetian relied on accusations of corruption, inefficiency, or even conspiracy to justify punitive action, carefully documenting cases to avoid perceptions of arbitrariness. By coupling rewards with consequences, she maintained a system in which loyalty and competence were both incentivized and enforced. Intrigue within the palace itself among concubines, attendants, and family members was equally significant. Wu Zetian maintained control over the harem and inner courts by cultivating loyalty and carefully managing alliances. Family members who posed potential threats were either sidelined, strategically married into loyal households, or incorporated into ceremonial roles that minimized political influence. This control extended into the daily life of the palace, where ceremonial precedents, audience protocol, and seating arrangements were all leveraged to reinforce hierarchy and signal authority. Intelligence networks amplified her ability to respond to factional tensions. Reports from eunuchs, palace staff, and loyal officials allowed Wu Zetian to anticipate challenges, neutralize plots, and reward subtle acts of loyalty. She understood that timely information could prevent minor disputes from escalating into crisis and could also be used to manipulate perception, shaping both the internal politics of the court and the broader political climate of the empire. Her manipulation of rivalries was often psychological as well as practical. By creating controlled competition between factions, she prevented any single group from dominating the court, ensuring that influence remained diffuse yet dependent on her approval. Officials learned that advancement required careful navigation of both loyalty and competence, reinforcing the perception that authority ultimately flowed from the empress herself. In this sense, factionalism was transformed from a threat into a tool for reinforcing central power. Even the most mundane court rituals were leveraged to consolidate authority. Ceremonial events, audience protocols, and administrative procedures were orchestrated to reinforce hierarchy, signal favor, and subtly remind officials of their dependence on central authority. Wu Zetian's careful attention to these details illustrates that power in the Tang court was not exercised solely through policy or force, but through perception, ritual, and the subtle orchestration of relationships. By the end of Section 2, it is clear that Wu Zetian's management of the court was both sophisticated and comprehensive. She converted factionalism from a potential source of instability into a reinforcing mechanism for loyalty, authority, and political control. Eunuchs, ministers, family members, and palace attendants all operated within a system in which competition was permitted but closely monitored, and in which ultimate power flowed unmistakably from the empress. As this section closes, one central question emerges: how does a ruler balance the need for active manipulation of court factions with the risk of alienating key actors who are essential for governance? Wu Zetian's approach suggests that careful observation, strategic rotation, selective promotion, and controlled rivalry can transform potential instability into a structured system of loyalty and authority, a delicate balance that defined much of her reign. By the later years of her reign, Wu Zetian had achieved remarkable control over the Tang imperial court. What had begun as a delicate balancing act of loyalty, rivalry, and perception had evolved into a finely tuned system in which factionalism, court intrigue, and the influence of eunuchs reinforced rather than threatened her authority. Her strategies ensured that the bureaucracy remained efficient, officials remained dependent on her approval, and the inner workings of the palace operated according to a hierarchy that she alone defined. One of her most notable achievements was the neutralization of rival factions that could have challenged her rule. Ministers who opposed her ascension or questioned her legitimacy were either reassigned to distant provinces, dismissed under charges of inefficiency or disloyalty, or brought under her direct supervision. By carefully calibrating punitive measures, Wu Zetian demonstrated decisiveness without alienating the broader bureaucracy. She created a system in which loyalty was rewarded, competence was recognized, and opposition became both visible and risky. Eunuchs continued to play a central role in consolidating authority. Their access to the palace allowed them to monitor factional dynamics, relay information, and enforce directives. Wu Zetian ensured that key positions among eunuchs were filled by loyal individuals whose interests were tied to her continued success. These loyal intermediaries became an extension of imperial oversight, capable of intervening in disputes, reporting disloyalty, and subtly shaping the behavior of officials. In essence, eunuchs became both agents of enforcement and instruments of political intelligence. Rotation of officials, a hallmark of her strategy, remained crucial to maintaining balance within the court. By periodically transferring governors, ministers, and high-ranking officials, she prevented the accumulation of entrenched local or bureaucratic power. Each reassignment reinforced the notion that advancement and influence depended directly on imperial favor rather than on family connections, factional loyalty, or personal networks. This system created a bureaucracy that was simultaneously competitive, accountable, and reliant on centralized oversight. Ceremonial management was another subtle but effective tool. Wu Zetian controlled seating arrangements, audience protocols, and ritual precedents to signal hierarchy, favor, and authority. These orchestrated displays of protocol reinforced perception, reminding officials and court attendants that power ultimately resided with the empress. Even seemingly minor details, such as the order in which ministers presented reports or the placement of officials during ceremonies, served to communicate the structure of power and reinforce obedience. Her mastery of court politics also included strategic alliances and symbolic gestures. Wu Zetian carefully cultivated relationships with loyal ministers, scholars, regional governors, rewarding them with titles, land, or ceremonial recognition. These alliances ensured that key actors were invested in her continued rule and incentivized to support her policies. Simultaneously, symbolic acts of generosity, piety, or moral leadership reinforced perception, both within the court and among the broader populace, creating a moral as well as political basis for loyalty. By the end of her reign, Wu Zetian had transformed the Tang court into a system in which political intrigue, rivalry, and factionalism no longer posed existential threats, but instead reinforced her authority. Competing interests were channeled into controlled rivalry monitored by loyal eunuchs and officials, and framed within a hierarchy that she fully defined. The result was a court that was politically dynamic yet stable, where advancement and influence were carefully tied to imperial approval, and where authority flowed unmistakably from the empress. The long-term impact of her court management extended beyond her lifetime. Subsequent emperors of the Tang Dynasty inherited a system in which strategic rotation, control, factionalism, and the careful integration of eunuchs into governance were established norms. Her methods demonstrated that political stability in a complex imperial court required both psychological insight and practical mechanisms. Rewards, punishments, ceremonial control, and intelligence networks worked together to maintain authority. Wu Zetian's strategies became a model for managing elite competition in imperial China, highlighting the enduring importance of perception, loyalty, and the subtle orchestration of political relationships. As this story concludes, one final reflection emerges: The inner working of power are rarely determined solely by titles, laws, or decrees. In the Tang court, as in many political environments, influence depended on perception, alliances, careful observation, and strategic manipulation. Wu Zetian's triumph in court politics demonstrates that authority is as much about managing relationship, controlling information, and orchestrating behavior as it is about formal power. Her legacy shows that a ruler who understands the subtleties of loyalty, rivalry, and factionalism can achieve stability and command in even the most challenging political landscapes.